On December 7, 1978, in Denver, Colorado, Antonio Livitz came back home from work at 6 p.m. He felt something wasn't right. His 9-month-old daughter was alone on the back porch, swinging, and his 3-year-old was watching TV in the dark. Antonio went upstairs and found his wife, Madeline Ferre Livitz, 33 years old, lying in a pool of blood in their bedroom. Madeline used to work for a kids' nature magazine named Ranger Rick and traveled a lot for her job. She also wrote a science book for children. The family had recently moved to Denver, where Antonio found a job at an architectural office. At the crime scene, it was discovered that Madeline had been stabbed several times, and there were other details of the case being withheld. But law enforcement confirmed that there were sexual elements in addition to the stabbing. There was no sign of forced entry, so it is believed that her attacker had knocked on the door, then forced their way into the home and made her go to the bedroom. There, the assailant stabbed her. The 2 children were not harmed in the attack. Authorities had no leads and said that at the time that Madeline had been killed, authorities had been hampered by several unsolved murders, and resources had been stretched thin. They did state that Madeline's murder was unrelated to all their other cases. Several samples of forensic evidence were taken and stored, but as it was 1978, there was not much they could do with DNA evidence. 2 years later, on Sunday, August 10, 1980, Denver police responded to a call on the 500 responding officers discovered 53-year-old Dolores Barajas, who suffered multiple stab wounds. Dolores died at the scene before medical help arrived. Dolores had been walking on her way to work at the Fairmont Hotel. She had recently moved to Denver for the summer to visit family. Originally from El Paso, Texas, that day was supposed to be her last shift of work before moving back to Texas. She was a mother, a grandmother, and very much loved by her family. The senseless attack had left law enforcement baffled, and for many years there had been no connection to Madeline's murder case. Later that year, another woman was found on December 24, 1980. She could not be identified at the time, but was later identified as 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris. Money was still on her body, eliminating robbery as motive. Gwen had last been seen at the Apollo Club Lounge on December 20th, 4 days before her body had been found. Again, little headway was made in solving her murder. Forensic evidence was collected and stored, and because it had been so different from Madeline and Dolores's murder, the 3 cases were not connected. Then, on January 24, 1981, a teenager named Antoinette Parks was found dead in a field next to 64th Avenue and Broadway in Denver. Annette was stabbed 23 times. She had been a 17-year-old high school student. She loved children and hoped to work with kids someday. Antoinette was just over 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. Her family said that she'd been very excited to be a mother herself. After exhausting all leads and evidence from these cases, all 4 cases would go cold. The circumstances of the cases had all been different. Madeline had been murdered in her home when a man presumably walked up to her door, barged in during broad daylight and attacked her while her children were also in the home. Dolores had been attacked in the street in the early morning hours. Gwen had been abducted on her way home in the very early morning hours, was abducted on her way home from school and dumped in a field. In 2004, Denver police started a dedicated cold case crime unit. They began to look at the cases of all 4 women. In 2013, they got their first connection. DNA evidence collected Dolores and Madeline to the same killer. 2 years later, in 2015, authorities could also connect Harris to that killer. And finally, in 2018, Parks was added to the list of victims of the same assailant. In 2014, the Denver Police Department used genealogy DNA services to locate relatives of the killer in Texas. After working with Texas departments in 2021, they came up with a suspect, Joseph Michael Irvin. Additionally, they also discovered that he was wanted on a murder charge in Texas and had an extensive criminal history. In 1969, Irvin, who was 17 at the time, was at a local bowling alley when he and an unidentified friend walked up to a car of 21-year-old Rodney Bonham. Irvin asked Rodney and his passenger a question. The confrontation turned hostile and Irvin pulled a gun and shot Rodney in the neck. Irvin then asked the passenger if they could drive. The passenger then managed to close the door and run to the bowling alley to call for help. After 4 days in the hospital, Rodney Bonham died from the gunshot. Irvin is said to have called the family after Rodney had died saying, quote, "I'm sorry he's dead, but we all have to go sometime. I'm sorry I shot him," end quote. It is then believed that he had fled to Colorado. According to criminal records in Colorado, he had been arrested in 1970 for a slew of he was acquitted by reason of insanity and was sent to a mental hospital in Pueblo, Colorado, but was released on a conditional bail in 1977. Then, on June 27, 1981, Aurora PD officer, 26-year-old Deborah Suker, pulled over a man that she believed was intoxicated. She radioed in her location, the man's name, and license plate number, asking for help in the arrest. She was in the process of arresting the man when he managed to break free. There was a scuffle, and in the struggle, the man managed to get a hold of Deborah's service weapon. At this time, a local man named Glenn Spies was driving by and stopped to help. The suspect shot Deborah in the head and Glenn in the back before fleeing the scene. When police arrived, Deborah was declared deceased. Deborah had just completed her first year as an officer and was married to a fellow officer. This would be Aurora PD's first line of duty shooting and forever changed the department's patrolling alone policy. Glenn was also rushed to the hospital where he was able to recover from his wounds. Unfortunately, the bullet exploded near his spine, and it would cost him the ability to join the police force as he walked with a limp and lived in constant pain. In July 1981, the Aurora City Council awarded him $10,000 for his heroism and sacrifice. Police found the temporary driver's license of the man that Deborah had pulled over in her patrol vehicle and identified him as Joe Irwin. They went to his address and found Joe there trying to get off his handcuffs by sawing his wrist. Joe Irwin was arrested. 5 days later, on July 1, 1981, Joe Irwin, who at the time was 30 years old, hung himself while in solitary cell in Adams County Jail. He left a suicide note which said, "To the Denver community, I pray that I will be forgiven for taking up your time and for my sickening behavior. To the kid in the hospital and Miss Core, I didn't mean what I did. I was so uptight. Forgive me." And it was signed Joe Irwin. After his arrest, police discovered that he was currently out on bail for sexual assault from 1980. After the suicide, police also discovered that there had been a mistake during his bail hearing. When putting his name into the computer database, authorities had put his birth year as 1952 when he was born in 1951. When police put the correct information into the database, Joe Irwin was arrested. Irwin came up as an alias. His real name was Joseph Michael Everin, and he was wanted in connection to a murder in Texas, and finally connecting him to the 4 unsolved cold cases in Denver and the murdered police officer in Aurora. After exhausting all efforts to find a cataloged piece of DNA from Irwin, Denver and Texas authorities petitioned the court to exhume his body and get a DNA sample. The courts approved the exhumation of Irvin in 2022. And shortly after, the Denver Police Department officially announced that Irvin was a serial killer connected to the killings of these 4 women in Denver. After 40 years, the families and the Denver community have answers to these cold cases. Some of the family members had these statements to say after finding out. Denver PD are currently going through old cold cases and looking for additional victims of sexual assault or murder and believe Irving had more victims that are currently unknown. While it is bittersweet to not have justice in this case, hopefully the victims and their families can rest easier knowing that this predator isn't here anymore to hurt anyone else. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Lieutenant Steve Scott from the University of Tennessee Police Department was doing his usual patrol at the Shelby County Regional Forensic Center in Memphis, which is linked to the university. He had a lot of experience in law enforcement, including working in narcotics at the Shelby County Sheriff's Office and being part of the K-9 unit there. But even with all his experience, he wasn't prepared for what he found just after midnight on June 2, 2002. While patrolling, he noticed some keys on the floor, which was odd. Then he heard banging noises. Following the sound, he found a man tied to a window security grate in an outdoor stairwell. The man, Dr. O'Brien Cleary, also known as O.C. Smith, was the chief medical examiner for Shelby County. He had barbed wire around his head and hands, and there was a homemade explosive device around his neck. Dr. Cleary's office and the county morgue were both in the forensic center. Lieutenant Scott highly respected the doctor, and the two men had become friends, in part due to their shared interest in firearms. Dr. Smith would later admit that he did not respond to the arrival of his friend on the scene as he should have. Instead of telling Lieutenant Scott to get away from him because of the bomb, he begged him for help. "I really did some things I shouldn't have done," Dr. Smith would tell reporter Janice Broach in 2006. "I called for him to help me. I wasn't man enough to shut up, and I begged him to come down. Despite his extensive training, Lieutenant Scott complied." In Dr. Smith's words, "He violated every protocol he knew to come down and talk to me." The Memphis Police Department bomb squad arrived on the scene, and its commander, Major Mike Willis, along with two other members of his team, successfully removed the bomb from Dr. Smith without it going off. Lieutenant Scott stayed with Dr. Smith until the device was disabled and he was freed from the grate. The barbed wire from Dr. Smith's wrists and legs was removed at the scene. But Dr. Smith wanted the wire around his head removed at the hospital, so those strands remained on his head as he was transported to the regional medical center. He was released after just 4 hours, having only sustained minor injuries. According to Dr. Smith, he had been attacked around 10 p.m. on June 1st as he was leaving his office. He saw a man, whom he described as being Caucasian with a fleshy face, approximately 6 feet tall and weighing roughly 200 pounds, out of the corner of his eye. He then felt 2 splashes of liquid, which would later be determined to be lye, hitting his face and burning him. The attacker then punched Dr. Smith in the stomach. The assailant led Dr. Smith down to the flight of stairs. Dr. Smith stumbled and fell and was dragged down the remaining steps, face down. The assailant then sat on the small of Dr. Smith's back and leaned forward to wrap Dr. Smith's legs with strands of barbed wire. He then hit Dr. Smith in the head and used other strands of barbed wire on Dr. Smith's wrists and head before lifting him up and padlocking him to the security gate. The attacker then affixed the bomb around Dr. Smith's neck with a canister under his chin and pulled out a tab that Dr. Smith assumed armed the bomb. The attacker did not speak until he was about to leave when he whispered in Dr. Smith's ear. Dr. Smith took this as a warning that the device that was now on his chest was motion sensitive. The reference to death row was initially viewed as a clue to the potential motive for the attack. Almost as soon as Dr. Smith was named Chief Medical Examiner in January of 2000, he had been heavily involved in the case of death row inmate Philip Workman. Workman's case will have its own video next week because it is too involved to quickly summarize here. For the purpose of this video, however, it is important to understand that this case was highly controversial and highly publicized. Dr. Smith had performed the autopsy of the victim in the case, Memphis Police Lieutenant Ronald Oliver, in 1981. By the time Dr. Smith became Chief Medical Examiner, there were serious concerns over whether or not Philip Workman had actually fired the shot that killed Lieutenant Oliver. Workman's trial and appeals lawyers had requested any images from the autopsy on 3 different occasions but were never provided with any. Workman's lawyers happened to notice a reference Dr. Smith made to x-rays taken during the autopsy in a letter he had written in reference to a clemency hearing for Workman set for March 8, 2000. They requested and were finally given access to the x-rays on March 2, 2000. They began the process of fighting for a new trial for Workman based on this new evidence. Dr. Smith claimed that he had not been aware that his office still had the x-rays until recently. Workman's lawyers argued that the x-rays were deliberately withheld. On March 30, 2001, Workman was granted a last-minute stay of execution so that his case could be reviewed by the appellate court. Shortly thereafter, in April of 2001, 3 strange and threatening letters were delivered to 3 different individuals. District Attorney General Bill Gibbons, reporter Lawrence Boozer from the Commercial Appeal, and Robert Hutton, one of Workman's attorneys. Hutton had received his letter 3 days after appearing on a Memphis radio show, during which he discussed his concerns about Dr. Smith. All the letters contained strange religious language, accusing Dr. Smith of being dishonest and trying to murder Workman. Smith must be returned to hell, for no purgatory can cleanse a soulless demon inhabiting a body made by the evil one, according to one of the letters. According to the letter writer, the evil one is in the body of O.C. Smith. soulless pawn of the devil, guilty of two mortal sins, the two sins being deceit and attempted murder. The letters refer to Workman who had become religious while in prison as an innocent child of the Holy Family that Dr. Smith was trying to murder. The letter writer was never identified. Dr. Smith was called to testify in the subsequent appellate proceeding in 2001. In his testimony, he rejected the testimony given by other expert witnesses and declared that Philip Workman's gun, and only Philip Workman's gun, could have been used in the crime. Prior to Dr. Smith's testimony, the defense seemed to have presented a strong case, based on the work of other experts, that Lieutenant Oliver had not been shot with Workman's gun. The judge in the proceedings ruled against Workman on January 7, 2002. While he cited a number of factors in his decision, Dr. Smith's testimony was one of them. Workman's attorneys again criticized Dr. Smith in the press throughout the following months. On March 13, 2002, a janitor discovered a bomb and two smaller explosive devices on a metal tray on the staircase outside the Regional Forensic Center. Dr. Smith was asked to come out and confirm that they were in fact explosives. He did, according to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who conducted the analysis on the devices. The largest device could have killed several people. The ATF also claimed to have evidence linking the bombs to the letter writer. Analysis of the tray the devices had been placed on would later find several religious phrases in cut-out letters. The phrases, now you know, scourging the flesh, crown of thorns, nail of the cross, fires of hell, forever steel, were found in between the layers of aluminum of the tray. The bomb found in March also bore similarities to the one used in the Junitat. Dr. Smith's attack was also tied to the letters because the bomb had the phrase, "Steel in the hands of the King of Kings," which had been used to end all of the letters, scratched into one side of it. The other side had the letters JMJ, which may stand for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, etched into it. The potentially religious overtones of the attack itself, the barbed wire which made Dr. Smith appear to have a crown of thorns upon his discovery, and his arms being outstretched in a manner that seemed to mimic the crucifixion, also made it appear that Doctor's attack in June was connected to the letters and the previous explosive devices. Philip Workman was interviewed in prison, and authorities investigated his family members, but no connection to the attack on Dr. Smith could be made. On June 3rd, the U.S. Attorney in Memphis, Terry Harris, announced to an assembled group of representatives from every law enforcement agency in the greater Memphis area that finding whoever was responsible for the attack on Dr. Smith would be their #1 priority. Dr. Smith and his wife were placed under 24-hour protection. 17 different agencies at the local, state, and federal levels would be involved in the investigation, and they would follow up on 112 leads over the next 2 years. Despite this massive effort, Dr. Smith's assailant was not identified. The tone of the investigation began to change by the fall of 2003. On September 15th, just 9 days before the day set for Philip Workman's execution, Tennessee Governor Phil Bredesen granted him a 4-month reprieve. His reasoning for granting the reprieve was a 15-month federal investigation in West Tennessee. On September 24th, Shelby County Mayor A.C. Wharton announced that he planned to remove Dr. Smith from office. Wharton argued that he had a responsibility to say to the county commission that circumstances have developed that there is a great likelihood that Dr. Smith cannot effectively perform his duties. Being attacked and having the person responsible remaining out on the loose would be a trying experience for anyone, and certainly could have affected Dr. Smith's ability to perform his job. However, this is not what was concerning Mayor Wharton. By this time, investigators on the case were coming to the conclusion that there had never been any attack, and that Dr. Smith had staged the entire incident. On September 11, 2003, Dr. Smith had been brought in for a meeting with Special Prosecutor Patrick Harris, not to be confused with U.S. Attorney Terry Harris and 2 investigators. The meeting was covertly recorded. The meeting began as Dr. Smith had probably expected it to, with him being asked to give his account of the attack. By the end of the meeting, however, Dr. Smith was being advised to confess to faking the entire incident to avoid the media circus that his trial for doing so would inevitably cause. He was offered a plea deal but refused it. Terry Harris would eventually testify that the transition from viewing Dr. Smith as the victim of a crime to the perpetrator of one was very slow. It was routine to eliminate individuals close to a crime as suspects, so Dr. Smith had to be looked at critically as a matter of procedure. He was not cleared right away, and questions about his story lingered rather than resolved. There were several factors that led investigators to the conclusion that Dr. Smith was responsible for the incident by the end of the summer of 2003. Some of these indications were present from the very beginning of the investigation, like the lack of cuts in Dr. Smith's clothing, and his minor injuries compared to what he claimed to have endured. Other indicators came over time, like the inconsistencies that came up in Dr. Smith's stories about what had happened that night in June. A federal grand jury was convened to examine the evidence against Dr. Smith. After hearing testimony for several months, the grand jury indicted Dr. Smith on 2 counts of making false statements to investigators and 1 count of unlawful possession of a bomb. If convicted on all charges, he was facing up to 20 years in prison. The indictment came down on February 10, 2004. Dr. Smith pled not guilty to the charges and was released on his own recognizance. Dr. Smith, knowing that the indictment would speed up the mayor's plans to replace him, then formally resigned from the medical examiner's office, as well as from his position as professor of pathology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Dr. Smith's trial began in February 2005. Terry Harris, the U.S. attorney based out of Memphis, recused himself and the Western District of Tennessee office from the case. Harris had worked as a prosecutor for Shelby County for 14 years, meaning he had worked closely with Dr. Smith. Harris considered Dr. Smith a personal friend, and so prosecuting his case was a conflict of interest. And Prosecutor Patrick Harris out of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Arkansas. Dr. Smith's defense attorney Gerald Easter tried to spin the trial, as the ATF and the boys from Little Rock appear persecutant O.C. Smith. While this statement obviously oversimplifies the situation, it does highlight an important aspect of Dr. Smith's trial. While federal attorneys from out of state accusing a local doctor of a serious crime might not have upset a jury, like Easter intended, the situation did make some members of local law enforcement uneasy. Dr. Smith had been with the Shelby County Medical Examiner's Office since 1978. He was well known and well liked by local law enforcement. He had a reputation amongst police officers for being willing to go to any crime scene at any time to move an investigation forward. Local prosecutors enjoyed having him testify in court because of his enthusiasm and ability to clearly explain complex concepts. He was an everyman with a working-class upbringing, but also a brilliant and successful doctor, which earned him a lot of friends and respect throughout the Memphis criminal justice community. He appeared to still have this respect even after his indictment. District Attorney General for Shelby County Bill Gibbons still called Dr. Smith as a witness in a criminal trial the same week he was indicted. Members of various local law enforcement agencies had to be called as witnesses during Dr. Smith's trial, and some were able to show their support of Smith in their testimony. Memphis Police Lieutenant Richard Borgers, for example, had been the first on the scene on June 2nd. He was able to testify that he did not believe Dr. Smith staged the attack because of the look of terror he had seen on Dr. Smith's face when he arrived on the scene. Dr. Smith's place in the criminal justice community did potentially jeopardize the investigation into the events of June 1st and 2nd, 2002, right from the beginning, as it did afford him considerations that would not have been available to the average victim of a crime. Dr. Smith was allowed to return to the crime scene the day after the attack and spend most of the day in his office. ATF agent Mike Rowland would testify at trial that he had been upset that Dr. Smith was allowed back at the scene when the attacker could have still been in the area. A bomb-sniffing dog reportedly hit on Dr. Smith's vehicle during the initial sweep of the area, but the vehicle was never processed by the crime lab because, according to Memphis Police Detective Connie Manis, Dr. Smith was upset by the idea. At trial, the prosecution had little physical evidence indicating that Dr. Smith had staged his attack. Agents from the ATF had found holes cut in barbed wire fences on Dr. Smith's farm, but samples from those fences did not match the barbed wire used during the attack. The prosecution tried to argue that a bottle found next to Dr. Smith had contained the lye, scientifically known as sodium hydroxide, that had been thrown at his face, and that the testing of the residue in that bottle showed that it had contained a heavily diluted solution of just 12% sodium hydroxide, which would burn skin, but not as harshly and instantly as solutions of between 25 and 50% would have. The defense argued that the amount of residue left in the bottle was too small for this testing to be accurate. The lack of physical evidence played a larger part in the prosecution's argument. They held that if Dr. Smith had been attacked as he had described to them, his injuries would have been much more severe. Dr. Smith's eyes were red from irritation at the hospital, but no sodium hydroxide had gotten into them, and no traces of it were found on the scrubs he had been wearing. If the solution had been thrown in his face by an assailant, it would not have been so precise and injury-sparing, according to the prosecution. Dr. Smith was also not seriously injured from any of the barbed wire that had been wrapped around him. He had a few scratches on his hands, but the injuries on his face were superficial. The trauma nurse who treated Dr. Smith at the hospital, Stephanie Ziegler, testified that while Dr. Smith's face was irritated, she did not see any punctures or lacerations on it, only noting breaks in the skin on his hands and wrists. Other witnesses would describe Dr. Smith as looking as though his face were sunburned or as though he had been in a fistfight the day after the alleged attack. Dr. Smith would later argue that his face did not have severe lacerations because the barbed wire was old and dull. While Dr. Smith's injuries may seem minor for the dramatic attack, trying to quantify how injured someone should be is problematic, especially when it is done by lawyers, not medical professionals. Another major issue the prosecution raised during the trial was how Dr. Smith's assailant was able to overpower him. Dr. Smith normally carried a gun and kept a knife in his boot, but had neither of them with him on the night he says he was attacked. While Dr. Smith was 49 in June 2002, he had been a medical officer in the Navy Reserves for the previous 25 years and had excellent physical fitness and self-defense reports. Bud Cummins raised the issue of why such a skilled individual would fail to put up a fight when being attacked. William Lee Hickey, who was the recipient of 3 Purple Hearts and the Navy Cross, testified that Dr. Smith was one of the finest doctors he had ever worked with while in the service. When asked on the stand why he thought Dr. Smith took such a passive approach when he was attacked, Hickey argued that part of dealing with a surprise attack involves staying calm and assessing the situation. Since Dr. Smith claimed he could not see after the lie hit his face, he would not have been able to see if his attacker was armed or not, so the passive approach may have been appropriate. The prosecution mainly took issue with the fact that Dr. Smith did not fight back after he was lying on the ground. According to Dr. Smith's early accounts of his attack, his assailant had sat on the small of his back and tied his feet with the barbed wire first. In this scenario, Dr. Smith's hands would have been free, giving him the ability to fight back. If he had pushed himself up, his assailant would have fallen to the ground, and he would have had the upper hand in either fighting him off or running away. This moment in Dr. Smith's account caused other problems for him as well. It is one of the main inconsistencies that helped turn suspicion towards him in the first place. In his initial statements to authorities, Dr. Smith provided detailed accounts of his attacker tying his feet before tying his wrists. In the September 2003 interview, he said that his wrists had been tied first. Dr. Smith had also initially given a detailed description of the assailant, but later said that he did not get a good look at him. All of these details show that Dr. Smith may have staged the attack, but they do not explain why he would have done so. To explain their proposed motive, prosecutors hired famed forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. Dr. Smith's lawyers would not allow him to be examined by Dr. Dietz. As such, Dr. Dietz had to limit his testimony to simply explaining the different types of disorders that would lead an individual to stage an attack on themselves. He talked at length about factitious disorder, in which an individual makes themselves appear ill in order to get attention. Prosecutors believed was an example of fictitious victimization, and that he had made it appear as though he had been attacked to garner sympathy from the public. The prosecution alleged that Dr. Smith's decision to stage the attack on himself in June 2002 was a bid to improve public perception of him. Faced with increasing criticism over his testimony in the Philip Workman case, a case which he had allegedly been obsessed with, Dr. Smith wanted to garner public sympathy. Being attacked by someone who opposed Workman being executed would have had the added benefit of making those who opposed Dr. Smith and his opinion of the case look unbalanced. While this theory sounds insane, it would technically be possible. ATF agent Michael Rowland testified that he had gone to the crime scene and had been able to attach himself to the security grate in the position Dr. Smith had been discovered in twice. So staging the attack would have been physically possible. The prosecution also presented details about Dr. Smith's personality and relationships that supported their theory. Dr. Smith had a reputation for not taking kindly to criticism or being questioned, and when he was named chief medical examiner, he had made a number of administrative changes that were not popular with the rest of the office. As the public criticism of Dr. Smith increased in regards to the Philip Workman case, the morale in the office decreased. Dr. Smith's lawyers even tried to argue that the theory that Dr. Smith staged the attack had originated in the medical examiner's office, suggested by disgruntled employees who resented Dr. Smith's new procedures. Autopsy technician Rhonda did testify that she and others in the office had been upset by some of the changes Dr. Smith had made, and admitted that she and some of our coworkers had discussed the possibility that Dr. Smith's attack was a hoax. However, she also said that Dr. Smith was brilliant, and burst into tears on the stand as she described how she loved and missed working with him. Dr. Stephen Symes, who had a very public falling out with Dr. Smith when he left the Regional Forensic Center, testified at the trial that while he had concerns about how the center was run under Dr. Smith, he still considered Dr. Smith to be the greatest he had ever worked with. While Dr. Smith's actions may not have always been appreciated, he was respected in his office. While Dr. Smith did have a long career in the Navy Reserves as a medical officer, he had a habit of misleading people about what exactly he did with the Navy. He claimed to have written the Marine Close Kill Manual, taught sniper tactics, and been sent on secret military intelligence operations. Commander Rick Russell, a Navy personnel records expert, was called to testify about Dr. Smith's service. Dr. Smith's records did not indicate that he had been involved in any intelligence missions. Dr. Smith's defense team tried to argue that the secret missions would not have been in his standard file, but according to Commander Russell, his location during such missions would have been noted in his file, and his total daily credits for active duty would have been higher if he had been on such missions. Commander Russell also testified that Dr. Smith had not received the required military training in the specialties he claimed to have. Also testified that there was no record of Dr. Smith ever having attended sniper training there, as he claimed. The defense continued to assert that not only had Dr. Smith been trained there, he had taught there as well. Other witnesses provided testimony about other grand claims Dr. Smith had made about himself. Michael Maines, a sheriff's deputy from Texas, testified that Dr. Smith had asked him about acquiring a large shipment of guns for a contact he had in the Middle East, while at a forensics conference in 2002. When he began making progress on fulfilling the request, Dr. Smith suddenly claimed that he was no longer hearing from his unnamed contact. Other acquaintances of Dr. Smith report that he had claimed to have been a mercenary in Central America and that his family had all been killed in Africa. These accounts were not accurate. The case was sent to the jury on February 25th. The jury deliberated for 3 full days but remained deadlocked. On March 1, 2005, U.S. District Judge Bernice Donald accepted the jury's assertion that they were unable to reach a verdict and declared a mistrial. On March 14th, prosecutors announced that they would not be retrying Dr. Smith. No other suspect in the attack on Dr. Smith has ever been identified. Only 3 members of the jury had wanted to find Dr. Smith guilty. At least 3 of the 9 jurors who voted to acquit Dr. Smith did so because they thought he had really been attacked. Other jurors did not buy into the idea of factitious victimization, and some did not believe that the prosecution had provided solid evidence that Dr. Smith faked his attack. I personally agree that there was not enough evidence presented at trial to prove Dr. Smith guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. When it comes to my own opinion about whether or not Dr. Smith staged his attack, I am conflicted. I can see how Dr. Smith, tired of being publicly criticized and known to fabricate stories to make himself look important, might create scenarios in which he is the victim. I think it is believable that he sent the threatening letters and left the explosive devices outside of his office. As larger than life as some of his fabricated military achievements are, I even think that it is conceivable that Dr. Smith burned himself with lye, strapped himself to a security grate, and claimed to be attacked. I stopped thinking that Dr. Smith have faked the attack as soon as the live bomb attached to his chest comes into play. I cannot imagine putting a live explosive device around my own neck for any reason. I suppose Dr. Smith could have done so if he really were mentally ill. He also was familiar with what the Memphis Police Bomb Squad would be able to safely disarm, and could have built a device to comply with their knowledge to maximize his chances of surviving unharmed. That being said, the bomb still keeps me from fully accepting the idea that the attack was a hoax. If Dr. Smith was attacked as he claimed, I am puzzled by the lack of any further escalation from his attacker. If the assailant was as unstable as he appeared in his letters, and he did escalate from the letters to the devices outside the forensic center to the attack on Dr. Smith, I find it hard to believe that he simply stopped his dangerous behavior called turkey, unless he passed away shortly after assaulting Dr. Smith. Even though no one was seriously injured in this incident, the lack of resolution to it is still troubling. If Dr. Smith was attacked, a dangerous criminal has remained free. While we don't know of any similar crimes this individual has committed since 2002, that does not mean that he did not change his patterns and continue to harm others. If Dr. Smith did fake the attack, it is even more troubling. Dr. Smith performed thousands of autopsies and testified at hundreds of criminal trials, some of which were capital cases. I am concerned by the idea that someone who was deeply disturbed enough to place the lives of 4 law enforcement officers and himself in danger just to get people to stop criticizing his work played a part in so many serious matters. Dr. Smith attempted to get his job in the medical examiner's office back after his trial, but was unsuccessful, possibly due to these concerns, which have never been definitively assuaged. Dr. Smith's life was not the only one derailed by his trial. His friend, Lieutenant Steve Scott, the police officer who discovered him on June 2, 2002, also feared legal repercussions once the investigation turned towards Dr. Smith. Lieutenant Scott was interrogated by the ATF so many times that he began to fear that he was going to be charged as Dr. Smith's accomplice. No charges were ever filed against him, but prosecutors did tell reporter Janice that they did believe that Lieutenant Scott was withholding information from them. By 2005, Lieutenant Scott was suffering from liver cancer. His wife, Virginia Scott, alleges that his health took a rapid decline during Dr. Smith's trial due to the stress it put him under. Lieutenant Scott testified at the trial, bringing Dr. Smith to tears in the courtroom with his account of finding him that night. The Scotts remained close with Dr. Smith. Virginia asked him to be with her at a meeting with Steve's doctors discussing his prognosis. At that meeting, doctors told her that all they had left to do for Steve was put him in hospice care. Lieutenant Steve Scott passed away just a few months after Dr. Smith's trial ended. Virginia Scott believes she would have had more time with her husband had federal agents not investigated him so thoroughly. I feel like Steve would be alive had the ATF not harassed him so much. Trying to make a case, she told Janice in 2006. Dr. Smith went into private practice after he was not allowed back in at the medical examiner's office, testifying as an expert witness on behalf of defendants at their trials. In 2006, he announced that he had plans to write a book about his attack and the ensuing trial that would provide additional information about the case. He was looking for a publisher at the time. He does not appear to have ever found one, as the book was never published. Dr. Smith passed away on July 9, 2019, at the age of 66. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. It was on November 14, 1971 when best friends, 15-year-old Maria Johnson and 15-year-old Debbie Ackerman set out for a surfing trip headed out for Galveston, Texas. Galveston is known for its beautiful beaches, year-round sunny weather, and some of the best surfing in the United States. The two teens weren't nearly inseparable. Debbie was outgoing, bubbly, and remembered as always laughing. Maria was more shy. Lots of people knew her to be quiet, but close friends knew her true and chatty nature. The two were just starting out in life and were full of hope and promise, excellent students who both loved the outdoors, especially surfing. Debbie was a champion water skier. Born and raised in Galveston, she was a natural at water sports and took to it easily. Maria had recently moved to the island, and the two had met at Ball High School, and the two quickly became best friends. The families of Maria and Debbie were also well acquainted with each other. Given their daughter's strong bond, There was no issue with them being out or going out on day trips, but the rule was that they stick together, call home if plans changed, and to be home by curfew. That day, the girls planned to visit Houston, Texas, which is around 55 miles from Galveston or about an hour's drive. As the girls were both 15, they didn't have cars yet and planned to hitchhike. But it was the 1970s, and it was incredibly common for young men and women to hitchhike across the globe. Whilst the practice has been outdated as pretty dangerous now, in the 1970s many young people saw it as the perfect way to get around. Hitchhiking in a pair seemed less dangerous than trying to hitch a ride alone. It was around midday on that Sunday. They were near Stewart Beach, outside of a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. Witnesses reported seeing the two buy ice cream and then start asking around for rides. A man in a white van pulled up to the curb and asked the girls where they were going. The two replied that they needed to get to Houston, and coincidentally, Houston was on his route. The two giggled as they got into their ride, not knowing it would be the last time they would ever be seen alive. Debbie and Maria's parents began to worry when they didn't receive a call from their daughters. Before the time of cell phones, the parents had no way of knowing if the girls had made it safely to Houston. The next morning, the worried parents called the Houston Police Department to report their daughters missing. Thankfully, the report was taken seriously, and they were not dubbed as runaways as many teens were during this time. The Galveston Police and Houston Police collaborated to coordinate a statewide search for the two girls. 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, the search for the two girls ended in heartbreak. A fisherman found the body of Maria first in Turner's Bayou in Texas City, roughly 18 miles from Galveston. Law enforcement then found Debbie's body 100 yards away. Both girls had their hands bound, had their clothes from their waist down removed, sexually assaulted, and shot twice to the back of the skull. Their bodies were then dumped in the waters below. The crime rocked Galveston, the state of Texas, and the nation, who would be so callous towards such young girls who were only trying to get to Houston. Despite the enormous media outcry, there were few leads and the case quickly went cold. The families of Debbie and Maria made multiple appeals for the guilty party to come forward, but those appeals fell on deaf ears. But the murder of these two young girls was not going to be the end for Texas law enforcement. There were going to be many more murders, all of similar circumstances to plague Texas. This would only be the beginning. And a week after Debbie Maria's bodies were discovered, the body of 14-year-old Colette Anais Wilson was found near the Attucks Reservoir. Colette had been missing since June 17th and had been abducted from Irvin, Texas, after band practice. She had also been shot execution-style to the back of the skull. After the discovery of Colette, another body was found nearby. This would be 19-year-old Glory Ann Gonzalez. She had disappeared from near her apartment on October 28th. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Then in January 1972, two boys found the bodies of 13-year-old Sharon Lynn Shaw and Rhonda Renee Johnson in Clear Lake, Galveston. The remains had been scaled till by the time they were discovered. The girls had been missing since August 4, 1971. They'd been abducted while at the beach in Harris County. In addition to these murders, there were 5 others, bringing the total to 11, all in a 12-month period, all with similar circumstances. Over the years, that number would grow to nearly 30 in the area, all unsolved cold cases. Debbie and Maria's case would be reopened in 1998 when convicted killer Edward Harold Bell sent letters to prosecutors in the area, confessing to the murders of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in 1971, along with 9 others. The letter started off with, "Dear Sir, I have decided to tell you I was brainwashed into killing Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in November 1971, and went on to say, quote, if you could get me immunity from prosecution of any kind, could lay a lot of stuff on you and I will." However, when examined, the confessions were deemed as unreliable evidence and dismissed. Bell was interviewed, but he asked for immunity in exchange for testimony and refused to cooperate. Harris County prosecution has gone on to say that letters have now been lost, though detectives who had been able to see the letters stated that there had been information about the crimes that had never been revealed to the public, leaving some to believe they were credible. Edward Bell was already serving a 71-year prison sentence for the murder of Larry Dickens. It was on August 24, 1978, when Bell was in Pasadena, California, parked in a local neighborhood. He was in his vehicle without pants on, watching a group of girls playing. A father and former Marine supervising the kids saw what was going on in the vehicle, and approached Bell, attempting to get the vehicle's keys so that Bell couldn't flee the scene. While confronting him, Bell drew a pistol and shot Larry. Larry was wounded and crawling back to his driveway when Bell got out of his vehicle, grabbed a shotgun from the back, and killed Larry Dickens before getting his keys and attempting to flee. He was caught soon after by law enforcement, but when he was released, he fled the state, eluding law enforcement for 14 years. He fled the country for Mexico and then Central America. It was a tip that came in that he was in Panama after he was shown on the TV program America's Most Wanted. It was there he was arrested and extradited back to California. Edward Bell was born in southern Texas in 1939, primarily living in the Houston area. He'd went to university to become a teacher, but it doesn't appear that he ever was. He was first arrested in 1966 for exposing himself to minors. He escaped jail by asking the judge for leniency and opted for psychiatric treatment, which he received. After treatment, he was arrested again in 1969 for the same crime. Again, jail was avoided in favor of psychiatric treatment. His first wife divorced him and also cut ties with his 3 children, citing him as a danger to herself and their kids. While in treatment, it was discovered that he was romancing patients there, and he ended up marrying a 17-year-old he met while in treatment. He was 31 at that time. After his release, he moved to Galveston with his new wife and became involved in a local surfing business. It was an area that Maria Johnson and Debbie Ackerman had been known to frequent, along with several other of these cold case victims. In 1974, he was arrested again, this time for violently sexually assaulting a patient that he'd met at a mental hospital he'd previously been at. The charges were dropped in that case as well, and he was never formally charged. He was arrested several times throughout his time in Texas, but each time he would always elude being formally charged. He eventually left Texas and moved to California. That was when the Larry Dickens murder occurred. So, an extensive criminal history of inappropriate behavior towards minors, sexual assault, violence, and abduction. He would brag to his friends that he could talk himself out of anything. But for such an extensive criminal history, it's shocking that he was still allowed to walk free for as long as he did. And whilst Edward Bell somewhat claimed responsibilities for the murders, he would later recant his confessions, making this case all the more confusing. Bell told the Daily Mail that his father had brainwashed him as a child to be a flasher and to sexually assault and kill girls. In his original letter, he confessed to murdering Debbie and Maria, along with Sharon Shaw, Rhonda Renee Johnson, Colette Anais Wilson, Gloria and Gonzalez, Georgia Gear, Brooks Bracewell, Nina Lynn Kluge, and Kimberly Ray Pitchford, who had been a 16-year-old murdered in 1973, and hadn't been believed to be connected to the other murders. He also confessed to an unnamed victim that has yet to be identified. He referred to them in his letters as the 11 that went to heaven. Bell then went on to take several interviews with local newspapers in 2017, quote, and did not kill Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson. He explained that he had confessed to the murders because he was suicidal at the time and wanted the state to sentence him to the death penalty. He also blamed his depression on a network of government spies that were conspiring against him. Throughout his various prison interviews, Bell mentions the supposed program that he was put through and the brainwashing he endured. In his letters, he confessed to callously taking the lives of Debbie Maria and countless other women, but he also notes that he was brainwashed to do so. One of the journalists who interviewed him believes that he suffers from some sort of severe psychiatric disorder. She described his behavior as erratic, paranoid, and full of grand conspiracies about the government. He never took full responsibility for the murders he committed. Instead, he said that he was forced to buy the program. And despite concerns that he was making everything up, the details about the crimes themselves were clear and matched police reports that were never made public. In addition to the confessions and that he lived in the area of the abductions, he also owned a white van. We know about the van because he was arrested while driving it in January 1972 for exposing himself to minors. This van matched the description of the vans that Debbie and Maria had last been seen getting into. At this point in time, It's unclear because it hasn't been made public if there's DNA evidence to compare. And it's also unclear if Texas law enforcement is continuing to look into Edward Bell as a suspect. It doesn't mean they aren't, it just means it isn't publicly available. There's also no solid evidence that we know of tying him to any of the murders at this point in time. All of the current evidence is circumstantial. Though records show, even when he was in Panama, wherever Edward Bell lived, teenage girls were abducted and murdered. A string of cases seem to follow him in all of the places he has ever been known to reside in. Unfortunately, Edward Bell passed away in 2019 at the age of 80 before investigators could verify his accounts further. Maria's sister told local media that she had no words for Edward Harold Bell, but was happy that he, quote, no longer walks this earth and will never be paroled. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Sophie Sergie was a student at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, where she was majoring in marine biology. In December 1992, Sophie underwent extensive orthodontic procedures and took the following semester off of school. Sophie was attending the university on a full academic scholarship, but needed to work to pay for the orthodontic work as well as have time to recover from the procedures. Sophie therefore spent early 1993 in her hometown of Pitkas Point, Alaska, living with her mother and younger brother. After her initial recovery, Sophie worked 2 jobs and traveled back to Fairbanks when she needed her braces adjusted. In April of 1993, 20-year-old Sophie made one of those trips to Fairbanks. She took the opportunity to spend time with her friend Shirley and planned to spend the night in her dorm room on the 2nd floor, Bartlett Hall on the university's campus. Sophie and Shirley spent the evening of April 25th with Shirley's boyfriend hanging out and eating pizza. Shortly after midnight, Sophie left the dorm to go outside and smoke a cigarette. Witnesses would later report that she had smoked with a group of students just outside of the dorm building. At 1:30 a.m., Sophie had not come back to the dorm room. Shirley left her a note on the door saying that she and her boyfriend were going to sleep in a different room. When she came back to her dorm later that morning on April 26th, the note was still on the door and there was no sign that Sophie had slept in the room. Shirley called Sophie's orthodontist office and learned that she had not shown up for her appointment. Sophie's body was discovered by a janitor around 2 o'clock that afternoon. She was lying face down in a bathtub in the 2nd floor bathroom of Bartlett Hall. She had not been found earlier in the day by the students using the sinks and showers because the bathtub was in a private room, off of the main bathroom. Sophie had been stabbed, shot, and sexually assaulted. The medical examiner estimated that she had died in the very early hours of the 26th. Authorities interviewed everyone who lived in Bartlett Hall, but found very few leads. There was DNA found on Sophie's body, but no match to it was ever found in any police database over the years. A cold case unit from the Alaska State Police re-interviewed every resident from Bartlett Hall they could find in 2010, but still no arrest was made in the case. Following the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the alleged Golden State Killer who was identified through genetic genealogy, the Alaska State Police decided to try the same approach in Sophie's case. They uploaded the DNA from her crime scene into GEDmatch, an open-source DNA database, originally developed to help individuals research their family trees. On December 18, 2018, a forensic genealogist identified a woman who was a close relative of the contributor of the DNA. That woman was eventually found to be the aunt of 44-year-old Stephen Downs. Downs was already known to investigators. In 1993, he had been an 18-year-old student at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks and had lived in Bartlett Hall. His roommate, Nicholas Dazer, worked as a security guard and had helped secure Sophie's crime scene in 1993. When Dazer was re-interviewed by the Alaska State Police in 2010, he told them that Downs had kept an H&R-22 revolver in their dorm room. That weapon would shoot bullets consistent with the one found in Sophie, but the markings on the bullet were too general to match it to a specific weapon. According to a state when he was identified as a suspect in Sophie's murder, Downs was living in his hometown of Auburn, Maine. Since 2011, he had been working as a nurse, but he had a history of poor performance and inappropriate behavior. He lost a nursing job in 2016 for a totality of substandard performance, according to his record with the Maine State Board of Nursing. He was also accused of inappropriate behavior with 2 female co-workers at that job, and had to complete a course on professional boundaries in nursing. Co-workers from his most recent job have come forward with allegations ranging from tampering with medications to mistreating patients. Several of his co-workers and patients reported being scared to be alone with him. The Maine State Police worked with the Alaska State Police to further investigate Downs. On February 13, 2019, they went to his home to interview him. He denied any involvement in the case, but said he remembered Sophie's face on posters that were put up after her murder and feeling sorry for her. The following day, the Maine State Police returned with warrants to collect a DNA sample from Downs in Sergie's house. The DNA was tested and confirmed to be a match to the DNA found at Sophie's crime scene. On February 15th, Stephen Downs was arrested and charged with murder and sexual assault. He is currently fighting extradition to Alaska to face these charges. Between 1991 and 2006, a serial rapist, eventually dubbed the NorCal rapist, assaulted at least 10 women in 6 counties in Northern California. He would force his way into victims' homes, restrain them, and rape them multiple times. He abducted some of his victims, taking them from their homes to force them to withdraw money from an ATM, which led to the infamous images of him on security footage, wearing a clear mask meant for burn victims. He apparently also stalked his victims. 2 weeks after he assaulted a woman on Halloween of 1996 wearing a skeleton mask, he called the dental office where she worked. He claimed to be sorry. One of his other victims was Maki Anderson. In July 1997, she was a 21-year-old student at Chico State University. During her attack, she managed to break free of the restraints the NorCal rapist had used on her. He rebounded her, but she broke free 2 more times. She then stabbed him in the arm with a pair of scissors. As was his habit, her attacker took Mackey's bedsheets with him in an attempt to limit the amount of evidence police had to investigate with. He left behind her pillowcase, though, and it had a sample of the blood he had lost in Mackey's brave attempt to fight him off. This was just one of the sources of DNA the NorCal rapist left behind at his crime scenes. Police were never able to find a match to it in any database, however. In 2018, the sample was entered into GEDmatch. Within 10 days of entering the sample, authorities were able to identify a suspect through one of his relatives, surveil him, collect a straw from his garbage can, test it, confirm that the suspect's DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes, and make an arrest. The man identified and arrested was named Roy Charles Waller. Waller was arrested as he arrived to work on September 20th, 2018. The 58-year-old worked as a safety specialist in the Environment, Health, and Safety Department at the University of California at Berkeley. On September 21st, the university released a statement saying that Waller was placed on investigative leave, and that they will be reviewing all open on-campus sexual assault cases to confirm that Waller had not been involved in them. When Waller had his first court date on September 24, 2018, Maki Anderson was sitting in the second row of the courtroom. Waller was charged with 12 counts of forcible sexual assault, all stemming from an hours-long attack on 2 roommates in October 2006. After the hearing, Maki spoke with the media outside of the courthouse. "I want him to know that he did not break me," she told them. "He did not break me, and I know what he has coming to him. He needs to be locked up until he learns what it is to be human. The original dozen charges, while our faces, could put him in prison for the rest of his life. However, the original 12 charges were only in connection to the one attack in Sacramento County. On January 7, 2019, he was also charged with 28 additional offenses, in connection with the crimes in 5 other California counties. He is next due to appear in court on March 8, 2019. On June 13, 1993, a woman called the property manager for her apartment in a building in the 3100 block of Pillsbury Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to complain that water was leaking into her apartment. The manager determined that the water was coming from a different unit in the building and let himself into it to investigate when there was no answer at the door. He found the water was coming from the shower, which had been left running. He also found a large amount of blood in the nude body of 35-year-old Jean Childs. She had been stabbed multiple times. Jean was a sex worker who brought her clients back to the apartment she was found in, which was rented by her boyfriend. He had been out of state at the time of her murder. Police collected several items from the scene that would eventually be tested for DNA, including a blue towel, a washcloth, a red t-shirt, a comforter, and a bloodstain in the sink. The unidentified DNA found at the scene was never matched to any sample in police DNA databases. In 2018, authorities uploaded the unknown DNA to a commercial DNA database and worked with a forensic genealogist to identify the contributor of the DNA. Police have not disclosed which database they used, but it does not appear to be GE'd Match, as the Hennepin County attorney described it as a genealogy company you see advertised on TV. The genealogist identified 2 individuals with the right amount of shared DNA to the relative found in the commercial database. In investigating the 2 individuals, police found that one of them had moved to the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area in early 1991 and moved away 6 months after Jean's murder. His police record was mostly composed of traffic violations and driving while intoxicated convictions for soliciting sex using the internet in 2015. In January 2019, police placed the suspect under surveillance and followed him to a hockey game. Police observed him buying a hot dog and wiping his mouth with a napkin before throwing it into a trash can along with the cardboard container the hot dog had been served in. They then collected the napkin and submitted it to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Laboratory to look for DNA on it. There were multiple DNA signatures on it, but one of them matched the unknown sample from Jean's crime scene. Based on this match, police arrested the suspect, 52-year-old Jerry Westrom, in February 2019. Westrom owned and operated several businesses, including an organic corn farm in Minnesota, and was an active supporter of 4-H and youth sports programs. He is married and the father of 3 children. A direct DNA sample was taken from him after his arrest, and it was confirmed to be a match to samples taken from the washcloth, the comforter, and the blue towel from the crime scene. Westrom spoke to police after his arrest and denied any involvement in Jean's death. He further claimed that he had never been in that apartment or in that apartment complex. He said he did not recognize Jean from her picture and denied having sex with any woman in Minneapolis in 1993. He could not explain why his DNA was found at the scene. Westrom was released on bail following his arrest. His family, as well as several friends, supported him in court for his first hearing. His attorney, Stephen Meshbesher, has told the media that his client intends to plead not guilty. He also claims that the evidence in the case is thin and that his client's arrest was premature. Westrom is due back in court on March 13, 2019. 30-year-old Jack Upton was a popular and responsible manager at a Safeway grocery store in Fremont, California. His co-workers were therefore worried when he missed several shifts at work. On December 17, 1990, police were called to check in on him at his apartment. There, police found Jack's body, beaten and stabbed to death. His 1985 Nissan 300ZX was missing from the apartment complex's lot. A week later, the car was found in a mall parking lot in Thousand Oaks, California, more than 350 miles away. Police were able to lift fingerprints from inside of it. At the crime scene and in the car, police found matching blood samples that they could not identify, but believed came from Jack's killer. Authorities would periodically run the DNA from the unidentified sample through databases as they continued to improve over the ensuing years, but they were never able to find it. In 2018, the Fremont Police Department contacted Parbon Nanolabs, who used forensic genealogy to identify Russell Anthony Guerrero as a potential suspect. In October 2018, Fremont police traveled to Tempe, Arizona, where Guerrero was living, to begin surveilling him. They were able to collect a discarded DNA sample from him, which proved to be a match to the DNA found in Jack's apartment and car. Sometime after the DNA match was made, Guerrero's fingerprints were determined to be a match to ones found in the car. On January 17, 2019, Guerrero was charged with 1 count of murder by the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. On January 22nd, Fremont detectives arrested him in Chandler, Arizona. Authorities have not yet found a connection between Jack Upton and Guerrero, nor have they identified a motive for the crime. Guerrero does have a criminal record. in several states. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Ezra Orin and her husband, Oscar, were both of Turkish descent, but they and their families were based in London. Ezra and Oscar moved to Ireland for work around 2007, where they lived in Clondalkin, West Dublin. They had a son, Eamon, there 2 years later, and Ezra took time away from work to take care of him. February 23, 2011 was less than a week before Ezra's 38th birthday. She was busy making preparations for her mother and mother-in-law to come for a visit from London the following day. At approximately 7:15 a.m., she told her husband that she would be running to a local shop to buy milk, but that she would be back in time for him to take the car to get to work. Ezra did not return. After a few hours, Oscar reported her missing. Ezra and Oscar's car was found at 11 o'clock that night, parked in a lot near the sea in Bray County, Wicklow. Her purse was locked in the trunk of the car and there was no sign of Ezra. Ezra's phone has never been recovered, but the last signal from it came on the far side of Bray Head from where the car was found. There were several pieces of surveillance footage of Ezra's car, a gray Renault Twingo, found from the day she went missing. The car was first seen at a roundabout, for minutes away from Ezra's house, but not until 40 minutes after she had left her home. The car was then picked up by cameras in Bray, driving erratically, once almost colliding with a Skoda Octavia. The parking lot where Ezra's car was found did have cameras, but none that showed the spot where the car was found. Despite the fact that her car was found in Bray, there is no evidence that Ezra ever actually made it there. In all of the surveillance footage of the car, the quality of the footage is not good enough to show who was driving it. There were public appeals for the driver of the Skoda Octavia that almost collided with Ezra's car to come forward in hopes that they could confirm or deny if Ezra had been driving her car at the time, but they were unsuccessful and the driver has never been identified. It is possible that something happened to Ezra in the 40 minutes between when she was last seen and when her car went through the roundabout. Her assailant then could have driven the car to Bray to ditch it, to throw off the investigation into her disappearance. While there is no footage showing who got out of Ezra's car in Bray, there is footage showing one angle of the lot where it was found. Authorities believe that there is one woman in the footage who could be Ezra. They say that the woman is walking without purpose, and that she is never seen in any of the footage walking back to the parking lot. Ezra's family has seen the footage, and they do not believe that it is her. Upon closer inspection of the footage, a small dog is visible. Ezra's family believes that the woman is walking the dog, and she seems like she isn't moving with purpose because she is waiting for the dog as it runs around. She does not necessarily have to return to the parking lot because she may live close by and walked home. A few months after Ezra went missing, her husband made the decision to move back to London with their son to be closer to family. While Oscar wanted to remain in Ireland to help keep pressure on investigators to work the case, he was afraid of what might happen if he had some sort of health crisis or accident, since he was the only relative his son, Eamon, had in Ireland. The main contact with the media for Ezra's family has been Ezra's sister, Berna Faddeen. Berna makes as many television and radio appearances as she can, and uses her vacation days from her job in the UK to travel to Ireland to post flyers and follow leads in her sister's case. On the first anniversary of Ezra's disappearance in 2012, her niece Ada joined Berna on her trip to Ireland to post flyers. In Neilstown, where Ezra had been a regular customer. As Ada left the shop, a worker ran out after her with a set of keys. On the keyring, there were pictures of Ezra, her son, and her husband. The car key was confirmed to be for Ezra's car. The keys had been left on the counter before Christmas of 2011, and the shop owner had kept them in case someone came back looking for them. There was no security footage of who left the keys on the counter. Ezra had lost a set of keys 6 months prior to her disappearance, around November 2010, but her sister does not believe that the keys found in the shop were the set. The security footage of Ezra's car driving in Bray was sent to the UK in 2018 in hopes that it could be enhanced enough to identify who was driving the car. The effort was unsuccessful. Ezra remains missing 8 years after her disappearance. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Connor and Sheila Dwyer lived in Fermoy County, Cork, where they had raised 2 sons. 62-year-old Connor had worked a variety of jobs throughout his life, including working as a plumber and a driver. In 1991, he was working part-time as a chauffeur for German businessman Fritz Wolf when he was in Ireland. 60-year-old Sheila was described by neighbors as lovely but somewhat reserved. The couple was last seen on April 30th, 1991, walking into St. Patrick's Church to attend a funeral. The following day, Sheila spoke on the phone with one of her sisters. Sheila was very close with both of her sisters, Nellie and Maisie, and spoke with them frequently. Maisie was therefore concerned about Sheila when she did not hear from her after May 1st. On May 18th, she went to the Dwyer's Chapel Hill home and knocked on the door, but got no response. She returned the next day with the Gardaí, who forced entry into the home, out of concern that something had happened to the couple. Connor and Sheila were not inside their home. Gardaí did find the couple's passports, reading glasses, and £1,000 in cash hidden in a biscuit tin. The only items missing from the home were a few pieces of clothing, presumably because Sheila and Connor had been wearing them, and the couple's white Toyota Cressida. Extensive searches have never found any sign of the Dwyers or their car. Their bank accounts have not been accessed since their disappearance. There were reported sightings of the couple in France and Germany over the years, but none of them have ever been confirmed, despite cooperation from Interpol to investigate them. The Dwyers did not have their passports, and ferry records do not show their car being transported abroad. A year prior to the couple's disappearance, another person from Fermoy went missing. 54-year-old Billy Fennessy was last seen on March 30th, 1990. There was no sign of Billy for the next 22 years until October 2012. A car with human remains inside was found at the bottom of the River Blackstone during a routine dive by the Blackwater Sub-Aqua Search and Rescue Team. The car was the same Megan model as Billy's, and in May 2013 DNA results confirmed that it was indeed Billy found inside of it. The discovery of the car renewed concerns have accidentally driven into the river at a still unknown location. While various waterways were searched during the course of the investigation, Billy Fennessy's car went undetected during these searches, so it stands to reason that the Dwyer's car could still be hidden underwater. For now, the cause of the couple's disappearance remains a mystery. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. 41-year-old John Johnson is a father of 4 children who works as a taxi driver in his native Iceland. On February 8, 2019, he traveled to Dublin to participate in a poker tournament. His fiancée was supposed to come with him, but she was delayed when she had issues with her passport. John played a game of poker that night, and his fiancée arrived in Dublin the following morning, February 9th. She went to the hotel they were booked at, the Hotel Bonington, and was woke Jon up. While his fiancée was having coffee at the bar in the hotel, Jon walked outside. It is not known why he left the hotel. He never returned. His passport, phone, and wallet were all left behind in his hotel room, and there has been no activity on his bank account. When June was not found within 2 days, 12 friends and family members flew to Dublin from Iceland to help search for him. The area around the Hotel Bonington was methodically searched and covered in missing persons posters. According to his family, it would be out of character for June to have simply just walked away from his life and left them wondering where he was. He was very responsible and considerate and would call home if he ever worked late, but not a large enough amount of money that his family believed it would have caused undue stress for him. Surveillance footage helped trace Jon's route after he left his hotel. He left the hotel at 11:05 a.m. and was picked up on a camera at McGettigan's bar 2 minutes later. He is seen going on to Swords Road heading north. The last sighting of Jon was outside of Highfield Hospital, where he was seen heading north towards Collins Avenue. On February 23rd, intensive, large-scale search was conducted with the help of 80 volunteers. During a radio interview, one of Jon's brothers thanked the people of Dublin for their assistance in their search efforts, and also vowed that his family would not leave Dublin without Jon. Jon, so far, remains missing. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. 36-year-old Shawn Duffy lived in rural Menacross, Dunglow. He had a burly build and stood at 6 foot 4 inches tall and was described by one of his neighbors as a tank of a man. He used his imposing figure in some of his odd jobs as a bouncer. He made his living doing a variety of other things as well, including working as a driver and an undertaker. While he was known for being physically imposing, he was also notable for his sense of style, usually going out in a tweed jacket and tie. He was close to his large family, including his 2 brothers and 5 sisters. Shawn spent the evening of January 28, 2005, out at the Strand Bar with his brother Kevin of January 29th. Later that day, Kevin went to see Shawn and was surprised to find the front door of Shawn's small bungalow unlocked. When he went inside, he found Shawn's body lying face down on the couch. He had been stabbed, beaten, and had an arrow from a crossbow sticking out of his right arm. In the course of the investigation into Shawn's death, over 1,400 lines of inquiry were pursued, and authorities interviewed over 700 witnesses. Shawn's multiple jobs and varied hobbies, while they made him an interesting character, gave authorities lots of leads to follow up on. While Shawn cared about his community and took time to help his elderly neighbors, his diverse interests also included things that could be construed as dangerous enough to become motives for his murder. His own mother has said that Shawn had a lot of enemies, and there were concerns over his dealings with horse races and the buying and reselling of cars. At the time of his death, Shawn also had an assault charge pending against him. It has been theorized that multiple assailants must have been involved in Shawn's murder. Given his size and strength, he would be difficult for one person to physically overpower. The use of multiple weapons also supports this theory. Following the 14th anniversary of Shawn's murder in 2019, Vigardi appealed to the public for information with Detective Inspector Pat O'Donnell, reminding the community that it is never too late to come forward with information in the case. O'Donnell also announced that evidence from the case is being re-examined in hopes that the advances in technology since Shawn's death will result in a DNA profile that will help move the case forward. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Rhonda Runningbird was born on November 22nd in Camrose, Alberta. Shortly thereafter, she and her mother moved back to the Siksika Nation to be with family. Shortly after she graduated high school, Rhonda met her first husband and had 2 children. A few years later, at a family party, she met Fred Legros, her aunt's husband. Not long after meeting, Rhonda and Fred left their spouses and moved in together in Red. Rhonda gave birth to their son in January 1994. On March 26, 1995, Fred, Rhonda, their 14-month-old son and Fred's aunt went out on a hunting trip to Swan Lake, Alberta. Rhonda never came back from the trip. According to Logrel, his truck had gotten stuck in the mud, and he had stormed off into the woods with a shotgun in frustration. When he came back after dark, Rhonda had left the truck to go for help. When Logrel and his aunt finally found help 2 days later, Rhonda was reported missing. Although Fred did not wait to show authorities where the truck had gotten stuck and therefore where to start their search for Rhonda. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police did search for Rhonda, but after a few days, the medical examiner told them that Rhonda could not have survived for that long out in the woods on her own, and the search was called off. When Rhonda's family arrived to search for her, they had the first of many disrespectful and frustrating interactions with the RCMP. The first officer, Rhonda's mother, Mavis Crowchild, told her that the reason they had not found her daughter was because she was off on the streets of Edmonton, getting drunk. Rhonda's family, in the course of their own search of the area, located a pair of glasses, an unused colostomy bag, and a pair of shoes, tied in a distinctive fashion, that they believed belonged to Rhonda. The RCMP told them that none of the items belonged to Rhonda. This was in part because the prescription of the lenses and the glasses did not match Rhonda's. However, the RCMP obtained Rhonda's prescription from an optometrist she was no longer seeing, and they refused to compare the glasses to records from her current optometrist. The idea that Rhonda walked off into the woods in the dark and got lost has also been highly contested by her family. According to family members who saw Rhonda just before the hunting trip, she was barely able to walk at the time. Logrel was physically abusive towards Rhonda, with one of the beatings he inflicted on her being so severe that she had to use a colostomy bag as a result of the internal damage it caused. Rhonda was scheduled for surgery the day after she went missing to repair this damage and hopefully lessen her pain and improve her poor health. She had been gathering evidence to have Lagrell charged with assault, something he had learned just prior to her disappearance. Even if Rhonda had mustered the strength to go search for help, her family does not believe she would have gotten so lost in the woods that her body was never found. According to Mavis Crowchild, Rhonda had been trained since she was a child in how to make her way if she were lost. If Rhonda had been physically able to get out and walk for help, she surely would have been able to navigate back to the major road that was less than a mile from where the truck got stuck. The RCMP says that there is a person of interest in Rhonda's disappearance, but that person has since passed away, and that there is not enough evidence to determine if foul play was involved in Rhonda going missing. Fred Lugrell died in 2016. Rhonda's two oldest children were placed in Mavis Crowchild's custody 2 months after she went missing, and her son with Lagrell was eventually left with Lagrell's aunt. Neither Rhonda nor her remains have ever been located. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. In the fall of 1971, 16-year-old Janice Hanigan was a sophomore at White Swan High School and lived on the Yakima Reservation in Washington State. In November, Janice was selected as a candidate for Queen for the Intertribal Veterans Day ceremonial that was held in the town of Toppenish. She was featured in a newspaper article detailing her family, accomplishments, and hobbies. Janice was going through a difficult period of her life. Her parents had recently separated, and her 6 younger siblings had left their family home near Harrow, Washington with their mother to go live in the town of Gwinnett. Janice had stayed behind to take care of their father. On December 21, 1971, Janice was admitted to the hospital with numerous contusions on her head and chest. She did not have any lingering neurological problems after a few days of being observed by doctors, and so she was discharged from the hospital on Christmas Eve with her discharge papers stating that she was in satisfactory condition at the time. She has not been seen since. Many of the important records at Janice's case have been lost. While some of her medical records remain, they are incomplete. We do not even know what hospital she was treated at and have no insight as to the cause of her injuries. Official documents contain errors which confuse the case. Several agencies list the date of Janice's disappearance as March 1, 1971, 9 months prior to when she went missing. It is possible that this is because of a missing persons report filed for Janice when she traveled to Lewiston, Idaho to attend a basketball game with her father in February. One of Janice's sisters, Trudy Lee Clark, was just 8 years old when Janice vanished. Her efforts to publicly advocate for Janice intensified after the death of their parents and continued until her own death on December 23, 2018, the day before the 47th anniversary of Janice's disappearance. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. Leona Kinsey was fiercely independent and took pride in how self-sufficient she could be. A member of the Puyallup tribe, she lived in rural La Grande, Oregon. She would hunt animals and gather berries and mushrooms to feed herself, and chopped the firewood she needed to stay warm. Leona worked 3 jobs: as a landscaper, a housekeeper at a motel, and as a custodian, to pay for anything she could not do or make herself. 1999, Leona left her home to go grocery shopping at a nearby Albertsons. On her way home, she was supposed to stop at her friend Nancy's house. On October 26th, Leona's daughter Carolyn, who was living in Lacey, Washington, received a panic phone message from Nancy. Leona had never made it to her house after her shopping trip, and she could not be found. Leona's boyfriend Lonnie told police that he had seen her around 430 on the 25th. Her friends also came forward, saying they had seen her at the same time, but at the local Walmart. On the morning of October 29th, Leona's light brown GMC Jimmy was found parked in the lot of the Albertsons she had been planning to go to on the 25th. The manager of the store did not believe that it had been there the night before. No clues were found inside of the vehicle. Leona's purse, pager, and cigarettes had all been left behind. Food had been left out to rot in her home. Something Leona, who did not like anything to go to waste, would not have done. Leona's beloved dog and cat were also left at her home, and those close to Leona are certain that she would not have abandoned them. Leona also had a full week of landscaping appointments booked for the week after she vanished. Despite her independent nature, Leona struggled with dependency on alcohol and drugs. Her daughter Carolyn believes that Leona met with foul play, and that the person responsible was a local alleged drug dealer. In 2008, Leona's family and friends, with the help of the Blue Mountain Sundance Society, held a memorial service for her, both to honor her memory and hopefully inspire people with information in the case to come forward. In 2015, Carolyn spoke with a La Grande Observer for a feature on her mother's case. These efforts have so far not resulted in Leona's disappearance being solved. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. In 1988, Betsy Owens was 15 years old and living in the Pangassi First Nation in Manitoba. She had 3 sisters and loved listening to music and going swimming. On Saturday, October 22nd, she left her family home. A police report says that she was going to play volleyball at a nearby school, but her family claims she was going to a school dance. Around 11 p.m., she and her boyfriend went to his house where they spent the night. Betsy left early the next morning. Her boyfriend was the last known person to see her. She never arrived home, and there has been no sign of her since. Extensive searches of the area were performed right after Betsy went missing, and another series of searches were conducted between 1996 and 1997. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have told Betsy's family that they believe foul play is involved in her disappearance, but they do not have enough evidence to make any arrests. One of Betsy's sisters provided DNA to authorities in 2013. Betsy's father has since passed away, never learning what happened to his daughter. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. A child is born after her parents have had 5 miscarriages before she came along. She was called the Miracle Baby. As the miracle child grew up, she became a kind, sweet, pretty, and a smart person. The Miracle Baby had dreams and aspirations just like any other teenager. But all those dreams were soon going to turn into a horrific nightmare. She was about to become a victim to a dreadful killing, where she was killed multiple times in the heart. Exactly 39 years after her death, police took a man into custody after matching his DNA to blood found at the crime scene. It was an arrest that reopened the 40-year-old cold case, which was now finally solved. 18-year-old high school student Michelle Martinko belonged from her hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Founded in 1858 and coeducational from its start, Iowa State became the nation's first designated land-grant institution. When the Iowa legislature accepted the provisions of the 1862 Morrill Act on September 11, 1862, making Iowa the first state in the nation to do so. Iowa State is known worldwide for its student-centered culture, and Michelle was a student who was an integral part of this culture. Michelle loved to dress up and style her blonde hair like Farrah Fawcett. Her family remembered her as being kind, sweet, funny, pretty, and smart. She sang in the school choir and wanted to study interior design at university. Her mom Janet had 5 miscarriages before Michelle was born. Michelle was born when Janet was 44 and she was known as the Miracle Baby. Diagnosed with scoliosis when she was just 12, Michelle had to wear a brace for 2 years to straighten her spine. Once the brace came off, she started getting a lot of attention from boys. One of those boys was Andy Seidel. Michelle and Andy dated for 2 years before they broke up. It was Michelle who wanted to end the relationship. She later dated another boy called Mike Myrick. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. But Andy wasn't prepared for her to move on. After they broke up, Andy wanted to know her every move. Who was she dating? Why was she dating that particular person? And everything else that concerned absolutely anything about her. On December 19, 1979, Michelle had gone to a choir for a New Year's celebration and then onto the mall in her hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to buy a coat. At the mall, she bumped into a few of her friends from school, as well as Andy. Andy had allegedly gone to the mall to buy Michelle a Christmas present. To Andy, Michelle seemed very happy. Curtis Thomas, another boy who knew Michelle, saw her leave the mall just before closing time. "I remember her smile," he said, "the goodbye smile." After leaving the mall, she walked to the family car, which she had left in a dark corner of the parking lot. She turned on the engine to warm it up and sat there for a minute. Then someone opened the door, pushed her over 29 times. One of the stabbings to her chest penetrated her aorta, and she bled to death in the car. When Michelle didn't arrive home that night, her family started to worry. Michelle's friend, Jane Hansen, remembered getting a call from Michelle's mother, Janet, who sounded frantic. 5 days before Christmas, at around 4 a.m. on the morning of December 20th, police found Michelle's body in the family car, which was still in the parking lot. She was lying on the passenger side floor. She had defensive wounds from fighting her attacker. She hadn't been sexually assaulted, and the cash she was carrying had not been taken. The attacker had been careful to hide his identity. He had worn rubber gloves, so he didn't leave fingerprints. A police spokesman said that everyone's instinct was to say that it was a guy, but they were not sure of the gender of the killer. Based on the number and location of stabbed wounds, police considered the killing to be personal in nature. At Michelle's funeral, Andy's behavior drew suspicion. Michelle's friend Gail Dawson remembered Andy being almost in the casket. Andy had his arms around her, and he was just sobbing. He said to Gail that he had to know who she loved when she died. Did she love him, or did she love Mike? Andy was questioned by police, but his mother provided an alibi for him. She said he was home from the mall by the time Michelle was murdered. Many people, including Michelle's family and friends, expected Andy to be charged, but he never was charged. He left Cedar Rapids to join the Navy. In the week after Martinko's murder, more than 200 people responded to the detectives' appeals in the news for information concerning the case. Police interviewed numerous people, and several of them were cleared of suspicion through the use of a polygraph. Rumors began to circulate about the crime. Some thought that Martinko had received harassing phone calls before her death, but police stated that they did not think so. On June 19, 1980, police released a composite sketch developed based on descriptions provided by two witnesses. The description was of the man they believed stabbed Martinko. The sketch indicated a white man in his late teens or early 20s, weighing between 165 and 175 pounds and standing about 6 feet tall. Despite a sketch in hand, a description of the probable killer, and 200 responses, the authorities were still not able to charge anyone with the murder. All the suspects coming in were soon cleared off. There was no solid evidence for an arrest to be made. Died in the 1990s, believing that Andy had killed their daughter. In 2006, 27 years after Martinko's killing, a new cold case investigator working for the Cedar Rapids Police Department became the investigator of this case. He discovered what he believed to be the killer's blood while he was reviewing the case files. From that, police were able to build a partial DNA profile. The results of the test for partial DNA were entered into the Combined DNA Index System, the National DNA Database, but no matches were found. Eventually, more than 125 people would have their DNA swabbed and compared against samples taken from the scene. Out of more than 80 potential suspects that had been identified over the years, more than 60 people were tested and eventually cleared of suspicion. A company specializing in DNA phenotyping was hired to create additional images of the killer, based solely on DNA clues about facial appearance and ancestry. The images looked considerably different from the 1980 composite sketch and showed a man with blonde hair and blue eyes. The company also produced approximations of how the man would have aged in the years since the crime. In a press conference during which the new image was shared, a former classmate of Martinko exclaimed that the face looked like another one of their classmates, but that classmate had been investigated and was cleared based on a DNA swab several years before. In 2018, the DNA Phenotype and Company took the data they had collected the year before and entered it into GEDmatch, a public genealogy website that has been used by law enforcement to solve other cold cases, most famously that of the Golden State Killer. GEDmatch returned one person who shared DNA markers with the suspect in Martinko's murder, and it determined them to be likely the killer's second cousin once removed. The company created a family tree starting with 4 sets of the woman's gria and reported that the killer was most likely descended from one of those couples. An investigator with the Cedar Rapids Police Department contacted DNA-tested members of 2 of the branches of the family tree and eliminated those branches as containing the killer. He then contacted a member of a 3rd branch, and a DNA test determined that they were first cousins with the killer. That narrowed the suspects down to a set of 3 brothers who had grown up in Manchester, Iowa. The brothers were placed under surveillance, and investigators began to attempt to collect their DNA secretly. On October 29, 2018, an investigator observed one of the brothers, Jerry Lynn Burns, drink multiple sodas using a plastic straw. When Burns disposed of the straw, the investigator collected it and tested it for DNA. Tests eliminated the other 2 brothers as suspects, but the DNA from Burns' straw matched the blood found on Martinko's clothing. On December 19, 2018, investigators went to Burns' business in Manchester, Iowa to interview him. He refused to voluntarily provide a sample of DNA, but was compelled to do so with a search warrant. His hands and arms were also examined for scars possibly left by the assumed cut sustained during the attack. Burns maintained that he did not know Martinko and was not there when she died. It's a homicide that happened at Westdale Mall. Michelle Martinko, is that something you've ever heard of?
Yeah.
Although an investigator later testified that Burns did not specifically deny killing Martinko, he was not able to provide an explanation for why his DNA would have been present at the crime scene. Burns showed almost no emotion during the interview, even when he was eventually told that he was being arrested. When asked if he had killed someone that night in 1979, Burns repeatedly told investigators to test his DNA. When the DNA sample was tested, it matched a blood sample found at the crime scene. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years after Martinko's murder, Burns was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty. His trial was originally scheduled for October 14, 2019, but in September, the defense requested a delay in order to gather more evidence and interview witnesses. The defense also requested the trial to be moved out to Lynn County. The prosecution did not resist either request, and the trial was rescheduled for February 10, 2020 in Scott County. The murder trial began on February 12, 2020. The prosecution emphasized the unlikelihood of the DNA evidence matching someone other than the person who left it at the scene. The doctor who performed Martinko's autopsy and investigators in the original case took the stand to testify to how investigation was conducted and to Martinko's cause of death. The defense argued that DNA evidence had been mishandled and that different articles of clothing from the scene should not have been stored together in one evidence bag. Prosecutors also played a video of a police interview of Burns, in which he denied being at the crime scene on the night of Martinko's murder, and could not explain how his DNA had been found at the scene. They also played a later recording after Burns' arrest, in which Burns questioned whether he could have blocked out the memory of committing the crime. The defense brought only one witness, a self-described forensic DNA consultant, who testified on the possibility that police could have mishandled the evidence. He stated that Burns' DNA could have been at the scene due to secondary transfer, such as skin cells transferring to an article of clothing when someone brushes up against another person, although he clarified that it was not his opinion that this was the case with Burns' DNA. Prosecutors called a criminalist to contradict the defense's witness. The criminalist said that the storage of Martinko's clothing was not unusual. On February 24, 2020, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Geraldine Burns guilty of first-degree murder of Michelle Martinko. Iowan law mandated a life sentence without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. On May 29, 2020, Burns' attorney filed a motion asking for a new trial, claiming his constitutional and state rights were violated, and that the court made a mistake in overruling the request for evidence to be suppressed. Finally, on August 7, 2020, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In September 2020, Burns filed a notice of appeal. Burns is currently still imprisoned in the Animos Estate Penitentiary. In a way, Michelle was there in that trial. She was there because she fought so hard, and she struggled, and she fought so hard that she caused the killer to cut himself. And with that cut, he left his blood. And with that blood, he left his DNA, which solved the mystery. What do you guys think? Was it Michelle who finally helped the detectives to solve the case of her own murder? What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. The blue-colored family of Kentucky history can tell us a lot about human beings. Sometimes, the stories of the past sound so unreal that it's very hard to believe them. For example, did you know that ancient Romans used to burn pepper and blow the fumes into a blind person's eyes to cure their blindness? It doesn't exactly fit our image of the great Romans now, does it? After finding out about this story, I was shocked but also curious at the same time. After digging into curious events from the past, I came across Martin and his blue-colored family. Wait, a real blue-colored family that's not from James Cameron's movie? Did you hear that right? 200 years ago, in the year 1820, a French orphan named Martin Fugates settled in the troublesome creek of eastern Kentucky. He had a simple reason to settle in Kentucky: to get married and start a family. Pretty much like any other human being on this planet, right? But there's a slight twist in the story. Fugate wasn't like the other people in this area, or even on this planet for that matter. He had a rare genetic condition due to which his skin color was a striking indigo blue. Despite his condition, Fugate found a match with a woman whose name was Elizabeth Smith. Even Elizabeth was described as being as pale as the mountain laurel that blooms every spring around the creek hollows. Nonetheless, Fugate and Elizabeth got married. In the 19th century, they wouldn't have any idea but what genes were, but little did they know that they both carried a recessive gene which caused a blood disorder called methemoglobinemia, because of which their skin color was extremely pale or even blue. After marriage, Fugate and Elizabeth had 7 kids, out of which the skin color of 4 of them was blue. The localities around them started calling them Blue Fugates. The locality in which the Blue Fugates were staying was a very rural and isolated region where even basic infrastructure, like proper roads, were lacking, like much of the world in the 1980s. Now, in modern times, it's safe to guess that these localities were extremely backward, both in terms of infrastructure and thinking. And with all this backwardness, imagine someone spotting a blue family. Although there weren't many people staying in their locality, it still made life tough for them. And even among those families, some were Lisbeth's own relatives. And for the other families to see a blue family every day, it was very weird and abnormal. And for this reason, they started ignoring and isolating the Fugate family. They were scared that if any of their family members happened to marry any member of the Fugate family, then the gene would get transferred to them and their future children would be the color blue. This belief was scientifically correct in hindsight, and nobody interacted with the Fugates. But the Fugates couldn't spend their life in isolation, so they decided that they'll start inbreeding. Inbreeding at the time wasn't very surprising or taboo, because people at the time would often happen to marry their cousins. This was perfectly acceptable because it wasn't easy for the family to find suitors, but it also made sure that the family property would stay within the family. But there's a definite downside of inbreeding. Inbred humans often carry mental and physical disorders. And the same happened with the Fugates. Because of inbreeding, the Met-age gene was preserved in their family and their lineage went on for a long, long time. As time passed, the descendants of the Fugate family started settling in other places as well, and they were even accepted in different states, after which people started viewing them as normal individuals. And because of this, it became possible for them to marry outside their family with members who did not share their genes. Now, I've said Met-age gene so many times that you might be confused. What is this condition? Methemoglobinemia is a rare condition which happens because of the overproduction of methemoglobinemia in the body. Because of its overproduction, the body tissues don't receive the required amount of oxygen, because of which the skin color eventually becomes blue. Usually, this condition is hereditary or happens because of the consumption of a specific food item or medicine. In many cases, both parents might not even be suffering from this condition and would have perfectly normal skin. What they still might carry the gene. But in the case of the Fugates, they not only had the recessive gene present in them, but one of them was also actively suffering from the condition. As a result, the chances of their children inheriting the condition became much higher. Initially, after looking at the Fugates, people used to think that they're the victim of some sort of illness. However, they were living a very normal and healthy lifestyle, except for the fact that their skin was blue. They showed no other symptoms of any kind of illness. But the story changed in our current times when Patrick and Rachel Ritchie, individuals with the same condition, thought it would be right to take the help of Dr. Madison Cowan. Hematologist Dr. Madison Cowan and his nurse Ruth Pendergrass were known for their immense contribution in the field of metaglobinemia. Their research was very significant in understanding the root cause of this condition and taking preventative action. After studying Patrick and Rachel, they compiled their whole family tree. In 1964, they said their detailed study that the blue color and pigmentation of the skin of the Fugates can disappear if methylene blue is injected into them. This blue dye could allegedly cancel out the blue blood and convert it to red. But convincing the Fugates to inject the blue dye wasn't an easy task. The Fugates had become very comfortable with the color of their skin. But because Patrick and Rachel had volunteered for their research, they decided to get this blue dye injected into them. What happened after taking this injection left everyone stunned. In just a few minutes after the injection, Patrick's skin color went from blue to pink. However, after that, it was known that the effect of the injection wears off as soon as the sufferer urinates. This is because the blue dye wasn't capable of fixing the enzyme deficiency that they had. So the solution that looked permanent was found to be very momentary. Dr. Cowan found one more fix through this experiment. He made a bunch of methylene blue pills for the family to consume every day. Meanwhile, Dr. Cowan and his nurse Ruth got to know through their study and research that before Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith, there were 2 more people who had this gene present in them. Because of this, modern-day experts and researchers still have debates and disagreements. Methylglobinemia patients are necessarily the descendants of the Fugates family. Dr. Ilu Tafari, who himself is a hematologist, says that he almost never see a patient with it today. It's a disease that one learns about in medical school, and it's infrequent enough to be on every exam in hematology. It also exemplifies the intersection between disease and society and the danger of misinformation and stigmatization. In the 1970s in Kentucky, the last Fugate was born. Benjamin Stacy was the last UGA to have blue skin, and he lived a healthy life. Benjamin was born with a dark, purplish skin right off the bat. Doctors were keen to know about the baby's health. After running the tests, it was known that the baby was healthy and carried the rare genetic disorder just like his family. However, as Benjamin grew up, the blue color from his skin started disappearing to a large extent. So much so that on his body, the color remained only on his lips and fingertips. And even that was only visible when he was angry or felt cold. This could have happened because Fugates moved out of Kentucky and married people from different regions. That's why maybe the effects of this condition were minimal in Benjamin. Fortunately or unfortunately, there's no trace of any more blue babies of the Fugates' descendants. However, it's quite possible that this condition must have existed in some other family in some other corner of the world. Now, where are they, and are they really there? This was a story of such a family about who I'm not sure many people know of. And I'm sure that there are even more stories that neither you nor I will ever find out about. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. When 8-year-old Maddie Clifton disappeared, an entire town sprung into action while the whole nation watched. Maddie had mysteriously vanished from her home in Jacksonville, Florida on November 3, 1998. Hundreds of volunteers joined search parties. Camera crews flocked to the suburbs, and her 2 parents tried not to despair. Then, after a week of relentless efforts, Maddie Clifton was found bludgeoned and ed to death under the bed of her 14-year-old neighbor. When police found her body, the neighbor first explained that he had struck Clifton in the face while playing basketball with her, then accidentally killed her when he hit her with the bat to stop her from crying. But the neighbor's account was only half of the Maddie Clifton story, and the truth was far more darker. The crime took place in such an unusual way that it shattered everyone, from the authorities to the citizens in the neighborhood. Nobody could believe that such a thing could actually exist and happen around them. Born on June 17, 1990 in Jacksonville, Florida, Maddie Clifton was raised at a time when parents allowed their children to roam free. The Columbine High School shooting had time to curb that lenience, and the fear of terrorism had yet to blanket a nation. Told to play outside on November 3, 1998, having no idea about what was going to happen to her, Maddie Clifton did just that. It was Tuesday when Maddie Clifton went out to play in the suburbs. Her father Steve, mother Sheila, and 11-year-old sister Jessie lived with her in the Jacksonville home. It was election day. Maddie had been at school that day, and after school, she went straight home and arrived back at the house around 4:30 p.m. At home, Maddie practiced her piano until her mother Sheila returned home from voting. As soon as Sheila was home, Maddie ran outside to play. She knew she had a short period of time to play before she needed to be home again for dinner. A lot of children played out on the street. Maddie went to her 16-year-old neighbor's yard to hit some golf balls. She returned to her own yard to get more golf balls. Sheila called Maddie and Jessie in for dinner at 6:20 p.m. There was no sign of Maddie in the yard, so Sheila asked her neighbors if they saw her. They helped to look for her, but she didn't appear to be anywhere on the street. Sheila called 911 to report her daughter missing at 6:30 p.m. The search for Maddie intensified and hundreds of volunteers looked for her, but she was not found. In the days that followed, thousands of flyers were handed out. Maddie's parents appealed for information. The media covered the disappearance extensively and police questioned neighbors. Some were questioned multiple times. The first 7 days of her disappearance were described as a circus. Non-stop search parties, police, news reporters, and missing prison flyers everywhere. Everyone was set on finding Maddie alive. The National Guard was even called to walk through the sewer systems for potential leads. The world had seemingly come to halt for her family. What went from a night of playing outside turned into every mother's worst nightmare. And nobody had an idea that it was going to turn into something worse than a nightmare. On November 10th, Maddie's parents had just finished taping an interview with a national news program, hoping it would result in information on Maddie's disappearance, when their neighbor Missy Phillips ran across the street to find a police officer. Phillips had led the officer to the bedroom of her 14-year-old son. Missy had been cleaning her son's room when she noticed his waterbed to be leaking onto the floor. She began checking the bed when she found the source of the leak. The leak turned out to be Maddie Clifton's body, which was entombed inside the frame. Maddie's body was found partially clothed, bludgeoned with a baseball bat multiple times. Missy Phillips had even been a part of the search parties, unaware that Maddie's body was so close inside her own house. Police drove to Missy Phillips' son, Joshua Earl Phillips, cool to arrest him for the murder of Maddie Clifton. I found Maddie Clifton this morning at about 7:30 a.m. Joshua Phillips was born on March 17, 1984 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, but in the early 1990s. His family moved across the street from the Cliftons in Florida. His father, Steve Phillips, a computer specialist, was incredibly strict and violent towards his wife, Melissa, and towards Josh as well. On January 13, 1999, Maddie's autopsy was made public, revealing she died of blunt impacts to the head with skull fractures. Stab wounds to the neck may have contributed to her death, but there was no evidence of S******ing injury. On November 16, 1998, prosecutors announced that they will try Joshua as an adult and will ask a Duval County grand jury for a first-degree murder indictment. And on November 19th, the grand jury indicted Phillips for first-degree murder. He was moved from the Juvenile Detention Center to the Duval County Jail, where he was held without bail to await a trial. As Joshua was arrested, he didn't take much time to confess to the murder, but in his own defensive ways. He confessed that he blended in with the rest of Maddie's searchers, although he could barely contain his harrowing secret. Only he knew where Maddie Clifton was, in his room and under his bed. According to Joshua, Maddie's murder was a bad decision that stemmed from an accident. Joshua then recalled the series of events that happened that day when Maddie disappeared. He said that Maddie had come over to ask him to play baseball with her outside. He was home alone at the time, and he agreed to Maddie's proposition. While they were playing outside, he accidentally hit a baseball in her eye. When she started to bleed, cry, and scream, he panicked. Joshua said that he was worried that his father would be angry and that fear caused him to drag Maddie Clifton into his house. As he physically dragged her inside, her lower clothing came off her body. Once upstairs, he beat her with a baseball bat to get her to stop crying and then shoved her under his bed. After that, his father did arrive home. Joshua spent the night with his family, and when he went back upstairs, he realized Maddie was still alive. At this point, he cut her with a small knife, then left her there once more. He later claimed that he was trying to ignore what he had done. "That was my defense for everything as a kid. If something was wrong, ignore it. It will go away," said Josh in his statement. But this did not simply go away though. On July 6, 1999, the trial for Maddie Clifton's murder started. Attorney Richard D. Nichols defended Joshua Phillips. Nichols' strategy was considered abnormal, as he did not call a single witness to the stand, nor did he allow Josh to testify. His whole argument hinged on his closing argument that the murder was an act that began as an accident and deteriorated through the panic that bordered on madness. State Attorney Harry Shorstein made an argument that the murder may have been ing motivated, even though there was no evidence of sexual assault. He pointed out some conflicting evidence and arguments, like there was no dirt on Maddie's lower body that would be consistent with Josh's story of her clothes coming off outside from being dragged. There was no blood on the baseball bat that Josh claimed hit Maddie, and this caused that there was no blood in the backyard where they were supposedly playing, and Maddie's older sister claimed that Josh would talk about sex with both her and Maddie. During the trial, the state walked the jury through the day of the murder, including computer history and records. What police found was that 30 minutes before Maddie Clifton's murder, Joshua had been using the family computer to browse hardcore and violent *********. Although the medical examiner found no evidence of assault, Maddie Clifton's pants and underwear were also from her body. There was one piece of inadmissible evidence from the defense that many believe could have also swayed the jury. Josh had brain scans taken from a neurologist that showed he had lesions on his frontal lobe. These lesions were in a spot that could, in theory, impair his judgment and induced panic and high stress. However, the judge did not allow that evidence to be weighed in the jury's decision. The trial only lasted 2 days, and the jury came to a decision within 2 hours of deliberating. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. Joshua Phillips was sentenced to life in prison without parole, as he was too young to receive the death penalty. He is imprisoned at Taylor NX in Perry, Florida. Since his trial, there have been multiple appeals for his case. In 2012, the Supreme Court declared sentencing juveniles to life in prison without parole as unconstitutional, which is one of the biggest factors in his upcoming resentencing trial in 2013. When Joshua began serving his sentence, the pain he inflicted on an innocent family continued. There was no closure for them despite the life sentence. Maddie's parents dealt with their grief in different ways, and they divorced after 25 years of marriage. They had been together for 30 years. Missy's husband, Steve Phillips, died in a car crash. In 2020, having exhausted other appeals, Joshua appealed to the Supreme Court, but the Florida Supreme Court turned down Joshua's appeal. Justices declined to hear arguments and the appeal. "I did something horrible. I am so sorry for what happened. I wished God that I could have known this or understood this when I was 14. Had I then, none of this would have come about. I had no clue what life meant, what death meant, nor the death of suffering that could follow one act." A psychiatrist assigned to the case claims that more weight should have been added to Joshua Phillips' background and family history. Had it been, the jury would have heard that he was *****ing abused as a child, had an abusive father, and had the mother dealing with extreme depression. The state of Florida claims that Joshua Phillips deserves to stay in prison, at least for another 25 years. What do you guys think about these contradictory arguments? And whom do you agree with? There's no doubt that Joshua Phillips killed Maddie Clifton, But why did he kill her? And should his young age, brain lesions, and prison behavior be taken into account for his 2023 resentencing? What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. One night, a husband would come home to his wife sleeping. He would go ahead and kiss her, but to his scary fortunes, the husband would find out that he actually kissed his dead wife. Today, we bring you to the forefront of a cold case from Iowa that gained national attraction due to the nature of its events that unfolded. It is hard to imagine that even a family can be torn apart to an extent that they end up pointing fingers and accusing each other of murder. As the person who was convicted for the killing was revealed to be the son of the victim, this case turned out to be highly sensational and controversial in its own ways. This case was riddled with accusations, backstories, and a lot of money. Shirley Carter was born on June 10, 1947 in Des Moines, Iowa. She was the daughter of a shoemaker. She married Bill Carter in 1963. The couple farmed together in the Pleasantville area. The two also had 3 children, after which Shirley took on the role of a mother, along with helping Bill in his work. Eventually, as their children grew up and got married, she also became a grandmother. On the day of June 19, 2015, everything drastically changed for the Carter family. Bill Carter had dropped off Shirley at their home after getting coffee in the morning. Bill then went to work to haul corn. This was a job that both he and his son Jason did on a contractual basis. After some time, Bill went to work on another load, and his son Jason went back home. It was then that Jason found his mother's lifeless body. Upon finding the body, Jason called to inform his sister before he called 911. And then it was the time when Bill received a call from his daughter stating that his wife was dead. In the 911 call, Jason also mentioned a bullet hole in the refrigerator. He reported that her arms were folded on her chest. Later he said that it looked like she was sleeping, so he kissed her. But when he came to his senses, he realized that he was kissing the lifeless body of his wife. Soon the police officers arrived at the scene with the DCI unit. Shirley Carter was found shot to death inside her residence in Lacona, Iowa. She was 68 years old at the time of her death. Were 2 gunshot wounds on her body. The first shot hit her at the bottom of her heart, while the second gunshot ruptured her heart. During the scanning of the crime scene, the authorities figured that no money was either stolen or even moved from where it was in the house. This made them believe strongly in the possibility of the involvement of a familiar person in the murder. Police officers were now more akin to assume that it could have been someone with a personal vendetta. There were several investigators who teamed up to solve this case. They chased several leads to bring the case to justice. They were sure of the involvement of a closely related person to the Carter family. But the question was who that person was. Was it Bill, Shirley's beloved husband? Was it Shirley's daughter? Or was it Jason, Shirley's own son? Soon the authorities were going to come across a probable motive that involved one of them. The investigation is where most things broke loose in this case. The Carter family, which seemingly had no problems when looked at from the outside, soon erupted with accusations against each other. Bill Carter claimed to be in immense frustration and grief. During this time, he attempted suicide 2 times, but could not get himself across the line to death. He then decided to take matters into his own hands by hiring an attorney and a private investigator. This investigation led him to file a wrongful death suit against his son, Jason Carter. Though Jason Carter was regarded as a suspect by the police officers, there were still no arrests made. Found out that Jason had several reasons for getting Shirley Carter killed. Jason had some ongoing financial troubles for which he was desperate to find solutions, and he had an alleged mistress who Shirley Carter got to know about recently. Jason Carter was also the next in line to inherit the farm. All of this made Bill Carter resolute in his belief that Jason had killed his mother. Bill also accused the law enforcement of not doing the investigation thoroughly. As Bill pushed with his claim against Jason, the trial of Jason for the wrongful death civil lawsuit began in 2017. The Marion County jury favored Bill Carter's claim and stated that Jason Carter would have to pay $10 million. Just 2 days after the civil verdict, Jason was charged and arrested for first-degree murder. And there began a series of accusations pointing fingers, seeking justice in higher courts and tricky criminal trials. In 2019, the case had a criminal trial in which Jason Carter was proved not guilty of his mother's murder. Since then, Jason Carter has focused on multiple attempts to overturn the civil verdict. Jason had argued that his father was responsible for shooting Shirley in the kitchen of their rural Lacona home. But even after this accusation, the jurors had their inclination towards Bill Carter's claim and they sided with him. On the other hand, Jason Carter's attorney, Allison claimed that the jury would never have reached the conclusion against Jason if they had heard about the new evidence that he claimed to know. Cain claimed that his team had a series of interviews that essentially contained the story, which implicates the Falwell brothers as having shot Shirley Carter. Cain filed a 46-page petition asking a judge to throw out the civil judgment. The petition gave new details about Joel and John Falwell, brothers who had a history of criminal drug charges in Marion County. A Marion County jail inmate allegedly told the authorities that the brothers confessed to him that they had killed Shirley Carter. He claimed that the Falwell brothers, along with Matt Kamerick, were burglarizing the home when Shirley Carter spooked them, so they shot her twice. Defense attorneys said that they just learned about the possible suspects because the Division of Criminal Investigation is required to turn over all its investigative files before the criminal trial. If the criminal trial had gone first, we would have had access to all this evidence that we would have been able to use in the civil trial, Cain said in Jason's defense. Bill Carter, on the other side, said that the new evidence doesn't change anything, and that his son Jason is responsible for Shirley Carter's death. In the now-dismissed action, Jason Carter had sued his father Bill Carter, his brother Billy Carter, and the estate, asking the court to vacate the civil judgment entered in 2017. As he has done prior, Jason Carter claimed that he obtained new evidence about law enforcement's investigation during the criminal discovery process as he mounted a defense to first-degree murder charges. However, the courts did not find that argument persuasive. Courts ruled that Jason Carter's team had knowledge of the evidence prior and that the newly discovered evidence was hearsay, and not admissible anyway. It also added that the evidence doesn't align with the theory Jason Carter had presented at a civil trial. As a result, the District Court and the Iowa Supreme Court concluded that the evidence would not have changed the civil verdict. Thus, they denied Jason Carter's attempts to vacate it to obtain a new trial. Later, in a state lawsuit, Jason Carter alleged a violation of constitutional rights, torturous infliction of severe emotional distress, negligent and wrongful termination, and abuse of process. Eventually, the state lawsuit was dismissed as well. The dismissal, which was on jurisdictional grounds, is pending appeal. A federal lawsuit filed along the same lines was originally dismissed, but then partially revived by appeal, and now it is pending another appeal. Unfortunately for Bill Carter, there's still no closure. He strongly believes that Jason killed his mother with strong motives in his bag, but Jason also seems adamant about proving his innocence and going all the way for it. But the question here remains, if Jason didn't kill his mother, who did? And does it mean that the killer is still out there? What do you guys think? Did Jason Carter plot the murder of his own mother and then stage a 911 call? Or was it Bill Carter who believed strongly that it was his son who killed his wife? Or was it someone else who wasn't even suspected during the investigation? What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It's late afternoon in the Calabar town of Queensland's picturesque scenic rim region, and a cool fall breeze softly sweeps through hundreds of fresh sunflowers. Vanessa Fowler, a mother of 2 visits to remember her beloved little sister. Vanessa says it was her favorite flower. She was a great lady in every aspect. She was strong, resilient, and passionate. The tragic murder of Allison Baden-Clay, her baby sister. What happened to her? Let us go into the investigation. Brisbane is the 3rd most populous city in Australia and is located in Queensland. It's known for the river that runs through it. Despite its location beside a river, the town constructed an urban beach that is the size of 5 Olympic swimming pools to preserve the street's beach. It was the place where the story of a woman's murder happened. It was among the most high-profile homicide cases Queensland has ever seen. The tale of the Baden-Clay family from Brisbane was first shown on Australian television in 2012. On April 20th, 2012, Friday, Gerard Baden-Clay called authorities at about 7:12 a.m. report his 43-year-old wife, Allison, missing. He said that Allison had gone for a walk in their wealthy Brookfield neighborhood early in the morning. According to Gerard, she did this frequently. She did not, however, come for breakfast that day. He told Allison's parents the same thing. The police started looking for the missing person right away. First, they questioned their neighbors if they had seen anything or remembered seeing either between 8:30 p.m. Thursday and 8 a.m. on Friday. A Holden Captiva and Toyota Prado were the vehicles. A search involving hundreds of volunteers along with the police began immediately. An extensive investigation, including aircraft and police on horseback, was conducted across the rough terrain. In addition, they looked in the D. Aguilar National Park's neighboring mountain forest. Firefighters also searched closed mine shafts. All of these attempts were organized by Sergeant Sharkey Lang. According to Gerard, on April 23rd, police set up a mannequin in the Baden-Clay front yard wearing the exact clothing Allison was last seen wearing. Allison was eventually discovered by a kayaker, not by the cops. On April 30th, the kayaker was near Anstead on Colo Creek. Allison was found at 11 a.m. on the muddy stream banks and resting on her side. Her arms were stretched out and her decomposition was advanced. Her blue shirt was pulled over her head, giving the impression that she had been dragged. Dental records were used to verify Allison's identification. According to the autopsy, Allison would have left significant gouge wounds on the intruder's face since some remains were under her nails. Her family and friends were beyond devastated upon hearing the news. Allison was a pure soul. She was a quiet and composed woman. On July 1st, 1968, Allison June Dickey was born. She was the second daughter of Priscilla and Jeff Dickey's 3 children. Allison was raised in Red Bank, a working-class area. She began her lifelong love of ballet at the age of 4, and her biggest dream was to start her own ballet studio. Allison won the Miss Brisbane beauty pageant at 25 in 1994 and was around 5 feet 6 inches tall. She was also an impressive polyglot, with Japanese, Dutch, English, French, German, and Swedish being among her languages. Her friends had always considered her to be lucky and could not have imagined such disastrous things to happen to this Wonder Woman. She was an ambitious woman who was on her way to accomplishing her dreams, but unfortunately fate stopped her. The family was beyond shattered and couldn't figure out who could have done it since Allison has no enemies. They didn't know how to convey the news to the 3 little souls waiting for their mommy to come back. Allison was the head of human resources at Flight Center Airport when she met Gerard Baden-Clay. He was based at their Tombow office. On August 23, 1997, they married. Gerard Baden-Clay was born in Bournemouth, England. He moved to Australia when he was 10 years old with his parents and 2 younger siblings. He was the great-grandson of Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts of America. Gerard is around 6 feet tall, with a medium body and short brown hair. The couple moved back to England after their marriage but returned to Australia in 1999. Gerard and Allison were both employed with Century 21 real estate company in 2004 and had 3 lovely young daughters. Gerard Bate and Clay became the managing director of Century 21 Real Estate, after which he finally partnered with 2 others, with Gerard becoming in charge of their real estate company's finances. Toni McHugh was a client of Gerard's real estate firm in 2007. She was a married mother and ended up ending her 17-year-long marriage. A buddy of hers assisted her in obtaining employment with Remax Real Estate Company. This guy had been Gerard's business partner, and it was through him that he had met Toni. Toni worked hard and eventually became a special agent there. Authorities interviewed several people throughout the inquiry, including Toni, Gerard, and his business partners. They started putting the puzzle pieces together one by one. According to investigators, Allison's insurance was worth $800,000 to $950,000. Allison's estate was also handed to her parents. Her life insurance plans were included in this, which also ordered that her 2 insurance plans were ordered to be kept in trust. Investigators had also found that someone was working on collecting Allison's life insurance while her body was being autopsied. It was Gerard, and there they found some evident marks on his face, which were expected to be made by Allison. But these were just assumptions. There was not enough evidence to prove him as the murderer. Where the Crown or prosecution said he sought to cash in on his wife's life insurance policy to pay off his debts. According to a forensic accountant, Gerard owed roughly $300,000 to various relatives and friends while he barely had $70,000 in his bank account. Tony McHugh was brought into the scene. Tony McHugh had said that Gerard phoned her after his wife vanished and ordered her to be quiet. She also said that he did not have the financial means to divorce her. These shocking revelations meant that Gerard and Tony were having an affair with one another. Gerard had informed Tony that he intended to divorce his wife and marry her one day, and he often met Tony without his wedding band on. He confessed to Tony that he loved her and intended to divorce his wife for her, but he also stated multiple times that he couldn't leave Allison because she was depressed. Gerard had also set up a phony email account to contact Tony without Allison being aware during this time. Allison, according to Gerard, was monitoring his phone conversations and text messages and had even imposed a curfew on him. If Allison knew about the affair, she definitely would have been surprised because the pair was in the middle of marriage counseling and had no intention of splitting. 3 days before her abduction, the couple had attended a marriage therapy session. Gerard Bade and Clay liked to present himself as a devout middle-class spouse and parent. He was concerned about his social position and how others perceived him. The truth, however, was completely different. Of course, Gerard had rekindled his romance with Tony McHugh. Gerard didn't appear to be working on his marriage, and he frequently publicly humiliated Allison. Gerard and Tony would be openly romantic toward one another at several work events they went together. He was also in debt to several friends and business acquaintances. Gerard admitted to his business partners that they were having financial problems at that point, which had surprised them because they had been having a great year and were unsure about where all of their money had gone. The business needed financial assistance, and all three partners agreed that any money leaving the company had to be signed. Gerard was no longer allowed to be the only one in charge of the capital. With Gerard Bade and Clay directly facing his partners, this barely lasted a few weeks. He didn't want to have to ask for their autographs constantly, and he repeatedly expressed his dissatisfaction with their lack of faith in him. Besides these incidences, Allison's diaries were introduced as evidence when the trial began on June 10, 2014. According to the journals, jurors heard Allison's views on her marriage and hardships, and how she tried to make her marriage work despite Gerard's treachery. Allison found out about the affair 3.5 years later. Tony was sacked from Gerard's Century 21 business in October 2011, putting an end to the romance. According to the prosecutor, Gerard murdered Allison for financial gain. On his behalf, Gerard testified. His side of the story was that he lied about everything he said in the past, but that everything he claimed at the trial was proper. Gerard acknowledged Tony's 4-year affair during his trial. He also admitted having previous relationships. However, none of them mattered because they were irrelevant to him. The jury didn't believe Gerard, and on July 15th, he was found guilty and condemned to life in jail with the prospect of release after 15 years. Gerard's defense attorneys sought an appeal in August 2015 based on a new premise. They were now claiming that Gerard had killed Allison accidentally during an altercation. He became scared and attempted to conceal the murder. On December 8th of that year, Gerard was successful in his appeal. Instead of being found guilty of murder, he was found guilty of manslaughter. Even though Gerard lied about how he got scratches on his face and sought to cover up Allison's death, the Court of Appeals found a reasonable inference that he was innocent of premeditated murder. The court dismissed the Crown's motive of financial gain. His marital problems were insufficient to warrant a murder conviction, and the prosecution erred by failing to introduce evidence excluding the possibility of accidental death. In July 2016, the High Court, consisting of 5 justices, heard an appeal from Queensland prosecutors who argued against Bade and initial Clay's conviction being downgraded. The High Court probed the defense about the change in their case. However, according to her autopsy, Allison died from a hit to the head after collapsing. It was ruled accidental, since there was a prior argument between the two and that cannot be counted as murder, but rather an accident. In August, the High Court restored the original Gerard Bade and Clay conviction and the unanimous verdict. Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Month is observed in May. We go into it knowing that in 2022, we've already lost 17 ladies in 4 months. Every time they've been slain, it's been by someone that they know. There are no winners in domestic violence. We've made some progress since Allison Baden-Clay's case stunned the country, but not nearly enough. Thanks to their support and devotion, Allison's friends and family have formed a foundation in her honor. Through education and assistance, the Allison Baden-Clay Foundation aims to raise attention to many types of domestic and familial abuse. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.